Alright, we tried having integrity, but the video bombed. Time to sell out. 5 Nights at Freddy's.
Don't worry, I'm just kidding around. I'm not kidding around. Don't play dumb, you know what FNAF is. Killer animatronics haunted by ghosts of kids because of a gangly purple man who was unfortunately British and owned a Chuck E. Cheese. It came up from nothing to become one of the biggest horror franchises of all time, for better or worse. Look, it's just pretty ironic that you can find Timmy Two Teeth running around in a shirt from Five Below repping fursuits plastered in entrails and mucus. There are plenty of things I can say about both this series and its creator, but I really didn't know if I had the willpower to make it happen. This video has been rumbling around in my head for a while, but hasn't materialized until now because of a few factors, one of which being the very premise of how I'd need to do it in the first place. A cut and dry retrospective in my usual style would be easy enough, there's plenty of people out there who would watch that too, but going that route felt a little overdone, you know? There are entire cities that could be populated by the amount of FNAF retrospectives that currently exist. It's so popular that it's unnecessary to recap its development and history because, well, everybody knows it by now. Though I'll still be clarifying some information so those living under rocks don't feel left out. I want to go in a bit of a different direction. While we'll still briefly cover my thoughts on Five Nights at Freddy's direction, gameplay, release timeline, and all that delicious nitty-gritty, I'd like to turn our focus towards something different. Plenty of people talk about FNAF lore, or theorize about how it all comes together, but as someone who focuses on writing, particularly thematic analysis and character building, I feel like it'd be fun to evaluate Freddy Fazbear and Friends from that perspective, trying to answer some key questions along the way. Is FNAF a good story on its own merits? What's the purpose of its narrative? What do we know about its cast? And did it ever stack up as worthy of all the clickbait hype it received? Because let's face it, Five Nights at Freddy's is more like a spectator sport than a gameplay experience. Most fans of these games might not even be playing them, and simply opt to watch popular Let's Plays and theory videos to get all the lore. The lore being the main draw.
I guess you could call it a lore franchise.
But lore is only as intriguing as the story it services, thus the idea for evaluating FNAF on a narrative level, and in doing this, I wanted to impose a few interesting restrictions on myself. For starters, this video is only going to focus on the Click Team era of games that were made primarily by series creator Scott Cawthon. We will not be touching Help Wanted VR, or its sequel FNAF AR, the mobile game, or Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, mostly because I view everything after Ultimate Custom Night as a second era of sorts, clearly helmed by a different creative team. And while they may have some plot threads that tie back to their simpler counterparts or retroactively change them, none of them do it enough for me to add like 4 more games here. Sorry. Roxanne Wolf could get it though.
Mwah.
The other restriction is that I'll not be using any supplementary material. No guidebooks, no novels, none of that. Not even the teasers or hidden messages on Scott Cawthon's website apply here. We are only going to be evaluating the narrative merits of the FNAF story as it is presented in the content of these 7 games. I'm going to briefly mention FNAF World, but I also don't think it's too crucial to the subject as I want to approach it here. I'm not one of those people that thinks that having a cross-media narrative is a bad thing. Just look at how much I shilled for Danganronpa Zero, and I adore a series like Kagero Project. But how many of you out there only know the story of the FNAF novels because you watched a video or read a wiki article about them? The most popular ones, the Silver Eyes trilogy, aren't even canon to the main universe and only inform some details about it due to having some overlapping concepts. Any story could become good when there's an endless amount of retroactive secondary documents to help bolster it up. I'm purely interested to see how well it functions as a story with what the games alone are able to present us. What I am dabbling in will include hidden minigames, visuals, phone calls, or spoken dialogue, and of course, any hidden text that you can see within the games themselves. Theorizing is not going to be entirely off the table. I'm allowing myself to make connections where I think they're feasible, but only within the context that I've been given for that entry or any prior. If I'm required to seek out a coloring book, a scholastic book fair pamphlet, or give MatPat his jollies to slot a piece of information into the story, it will not be included. MatPat retired while I was making this video. I'm sorry. Everybody on board? Okay, cool. A couple of disclaimers up front too. This video will have full spoilers for all of the games mentioned, and despite what desensitized 4th graders might have you believe, FNAF has some pretty brutal content sometimes, so here's an on-screen warning for all of what you may need to watch out for in this discussion. And also, I didn't record the gameplay footage this time, so here's an attribution on screen to everyone whose gameplay I utilized and for which game, just so that they get their due credit. I know this also sounds ironic given everything I said about people not playing the games, but I assure you it wasn't for a lack of trying. I'm just bad at it. Are you ready? Grab your party hats and stuff your gob with some crappy pizza. Let's get discussing the story of Five Nights at Freddy's. Everybody knows the story by now, right? Scott Cawthon was a game developer who made a bunch of games that didn't really get anywhere until he made a game about a chipmunk that gave people nightmares due to their uncanny valley appearance, with many mentioning that the models looked like lifeless animatronics. Instead of falling into despair, he utilized the once unintentional terror of his art style to make a strategic tower defense-like horror game about haunted showbiz pizza mascots, and soon enough he was rolling in the dough. A touching tale, but deeply funny considering the content. The first Five Nights at Freddy's is nothing particularly deep. You're glued to a seat, and for 6 in-game hours, thankfully shorter than it sounds, you're in charge of night shift security at the decrepit Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Freddy's is an old parlor filled with lousy animatronics, arcade games, and lethally greasy food, and unfortunately for you, the famed singing critters get the old leg cramps at night and decide to start walking around, quite frequently. If they see you, they'll apparently recognize you as a metal endoskeleton without a costume, which is against the rules at Freddy's, and will promptly try to shove you into a costume, which, thanks to its various mechanical parts, would kill you instantly. Do this for 5, by which the game means 7, titular nights, and all is well. I suppose 1 week at Freddy's didn't roll off the tongue properly. Kinda sounds like a bad Weekend at Bernie's sequel. This is all according to a guy who worked in the office before you, who gives you a call on the first night to lay it all out. The affectionately nicknamed Phone Guy, voiced by Cawthon himself. He spouts some pretty concerning legal jargon about the company not being responsible for damage or death, thoroughly cleaning and bleaching the place, and filing missing persons reports if anything happens, rather than assuming you'd be easily found. Your only defense from these guys is your lights and door buttons. The former lets you illuminate your blind spots right outside the doors to see if you're about to get slapped around, and the latter lets you barricade one or both sides of the hall to keep your new coworkers out. The way you'll be observing the animatronics' movements is with the camera feeds, which only have so many angles and are kind of low quality. In addition, using all of these functions quickly drains the restaurant's abysmal power supply. I assume all of their money went to the state-of-the-art death machines instead. If you run out of power, you'll go completely dark, and, well, you know the rest. No pingers! The animatronics you'll be dealing with are Freddy, who only becomes active during the later nights, but is a total bitch and a half to deal with, Bonnie and Chica, who constantly double-team your doors and are a general persistent nuisance, and Foxy, who usually only peeks out behind his Pirate Cove curtain from night 2 onward, but becomes murderously lonely if you don't consistently check up on him afterward.
I get it, we all have our moments, but I need my privacy. And my face.
My opinion is as easy to grasp as the game's humble beginnings. It's just good. One of the strongest in show, even. It utilizes its static simplicity very well, making up for its limitations with some truly creative solutions that I think drive the tension up flawlessly. Its sound design and its carefully balanced difficulty, both with the power system and its well-curated RNG components, make it a consistently creepy experience which never fails to get under my skin more than I'm expecting it to when I give it a replay. The best part of FNAF 1, though, in my opinion, is that when it comes to narrative, everything is short, sweet, and to the point. There are a few lingering threads left open, like an incident the phone guy mentions called the Bite of 87, which prevented the animatronics from being permitted to walk around during the day and evidently involved someone's frontal lobe being removed. But that aside, there's only one particular source to look into to glean any extra sensitive information. There's a rules for safety sign in the East Hall's corner cam, which can occasionally be randomly replaced with newspaper articles. Said articles allude to children going missing after being lured into a back room of the restaurant during its late hours. The suspect, a man who police suspect was using a mascot costume during the crimes, was apprehended, but the children's bodies were never found. Reports of foul odors as well as blood and mucus seeping from the animatronics were made, and the pizzeria was threatened with closure as the number of missing children jumped from 2 to 5. Despite the restaurant's attempts to stay afloat amidst heavy legal battling, it was forced to reach its closure by year's end, meaning we're sitting in the carcass of a company on borrowed time, while trying to avoid becoming one ourselves. The implication behind all of this is fairly obvious. Angry metal soul juice. The animatronics are haunted by the ghosts of the dead children, whose bodies may be taking up residence within the ribs of the Sunshine Gang. How the police never discovered rotting corpses inside of these clunkers is anyone's guess, but what matters now is that they're trying to kill our plucky protagonist. For what reason? Well, Phone Guy's explanation may not be entirely reliable if they are indeed being puppeted by spirits. The safe assumption is that these kids aren't entirely aware and may be more inclined toward vengeance, exacting violence upon anyone who might remind them of their killer. As we can see from our paycheck at the end, our protagonist seems to be one Mike Schmidt, who, aside from having a serious problem with thrill-seeking, has no other real defining information about him unless you account for his odor, as pointed out in his termination notice if you play the custom night mode. As for what remains, most of the phone calls are purely informational, trying to get you attuned to the game's various mechanics and how its AI behaves. The phone guy does imply several other employees have met grisly fates in the Night 3 call, and then he is also presumably killed during the recorded Night 4 call through unknown means. During the Night 5 phone call, a garbled up reading of reversed text is played, interspersed with the jump scare screams. The relevance of the actual text itself is questionable, but it comes from a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, which focuses on many encounters and experiences with spiritual figures. The excerpt discusses the use of machines to aid agricultural development, and how these things will likely not see greater use until a future beyond their creation, meaning that the scientist gets more pleasure from knowing they will have helped at all than seeing immediate recognition for said help. While I think this is mostly a random decision, probably predicated on the yogi part of the title, and doesn't have much of an intended narrative relevance, especially when considering that FNAF's greater lore was almost certainly written on the fly, let's keep a pin in this, because I do think it winds up tying somewhat well into later subjects that the series tackles. You might notice, by the way, that despite the game having 4 main animatronics, 5 missing children are mentioned. This is because there's one that's missing from the docket. Golden Freddy. Golden Freddy appears in the office rarely, and only under very specific circumstances. In the West Hall corner, there's a poster that will sometimes change into its face, which also plays the sound of a girl laughing. If you see this and switch back to the office, Golden Freddy will be present, slumped over like a corpse, unlike any other animatronic. Its presence provokes several flashing images, as well as the words, "It's me," a phrase which shows up in several other contexts in the game, like brief hallucinations, in bloody writing you can occasionally see on the wall, or on Foxy's sign when he leaves Pirate Cove. If you quickly bring the monitor back up and down upon seeing Golden Freddy, it will disappear, but if you keep staring at it, its face will take up the entire screen with a ghastly, almost glitchy sounding scream, and will crash the game. You can also see this screen by inputting 1, 9, 8, and 7 as the difficulty values for each animatronic on the game's custom night mode, though whether this actually means Golden Freddy has anything to do with the Bite of 87 in particular, we don't know. Golden Freddy is certainly the most mysterious aspect of the game, with its horrible posture reminding many people of the Night 3 phone call, where the phone guy suggests possibly going limp and playing dead if you're caught by the animatronics, before retracting said advice. Golden Freddy is almost assuredly possessed by one of the children because of the victim count, but why it behaves so differently and almost seems to appear at will is anyone's guess. That's the beauty of FNAF 1's storytelling. Its horror is defined by its ambiguity. There are just enough details to make sense of the proceedings, but not everything can be perfectly slotted into place. Many open questions linger, even the nature of the animatronics and Foxy's gender seemed up for debate at the time. While the haunting angle is an incredibly easy conclusion to come to, it was never concretely stated and thus open for interpretation. Combined with the tense gameplay and stilted, silent behavior of the animatronics themselves, it truly made them feel more like cold, lumbering creatures to me, and this greatly enhanced the fear factor. And while people obviously wanted more answers, I think I could have been satisfied with this self-contained narrative alone. Horror is all the more effective the less you know. There's a cold comfort to be found after you understand why what's scaring you exists. But when you're left hopeless without a light at the end of the tunnel to chase after, it's going to be much scarier to sit alone in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. 5 out of 5 pizzas. I desperately hope not to see Mr. Five Nights at Freddy's in my fridge to this day. Things could only remain easy for so long, however. FNAF 1 works excellently as a little spooky ghost story, but if it was going to continue, it needed to have its foundation built upon. And almost immediately afterward, everything got a lot more complicated. After the runaway success of FNAF 1 in July of 2014, a sequel was released just 4 months later in November.
Slow and steady never quite wins the race when your opponent is capitalism. Am I right, comrades?
I can't blame the guy for wanting to get that cash money.
My money long, my pockets deep.
and the game did immediately make some interesting innovations in the way that it worked, even if those innovations are heavy-handed. The goal of the gameplay loop is the same: survive the night from midnight to 6 a.m. and use the cameras to keep track of the animatronics. This time, however, there's a lot more mechanical interplay. You have to keep an eye on 2 vents as well as a main door now, and there's also a music box on the prize corner cam, which you must keep constantly remotely wound, or else Final Form Frieza with lipstick jumps out at you. Sorry, I mean the puppet. The base animatronics are all new this time, a fun toy line instead of the basic kind, which come back later in the week as withered versions of themselves, which look infinitely more terrifying. Seriously, these might be the most unsettling designs we've ever gotten from Scothin. You also no longer have any doors to protect yourself, which leaves you with 2 options. For most animatronics, you can don a Freddy mask, which convinces them well enough that you're one of them, despite the fact that we learn that they apparently have state-of-the-art predator-detecting scan eyes, which are hooked up to a police database? If they have this, then why do they not simply use them to find the killer? Are they stupid? For some of the others though, namely, Foxy, you have to use your flashlight on the center hallway to keep them stalled by locking them up and causing a system restart of sorts. Using the flashlight too much depletes its battery, but there's no battery limit to the building now, so you can gleefully check the cameras as much as you want. Granted, you won't be able to use the flashlight if you let Balloon Boy into your office, a portly, giggling prankster who opts not to kill you, but instead steal your batteries and leave you to helplessly scream while being mauled in the dark.
What a scamp. Truly the Bart Simpson of Five Nights at Freddy's.
You'll learn most of this from the returning phone guy, whose presence may immediately disorient you if you remember the story of the first game, because, didn't he die? Horribly? This does quite a bit already to narratively hook a returning player, which is great, because the gameplay struggles immensely. As much as I do enjoy the increased chaos of FNAF 2, it's just a little too much. There's far too many elements to keep track of, and attempting to keep the controls simplified while doing so makes it incredibly clunky while at the same time demanding you be incredibly precise, making the game ruthlessly difficult on later nights. Luckily, Scotty C thought about this difficulty spike because in order to squeeze every succulent drop of plot from this game, we're going to need to die. A lot. When you do, there's a chance you'll also randomly see these Atari-style death minigames, which allude to even more hidden story. Think of it as a more abstract version of the information we got from the hidden posters in FNAF 1. And this is where everything really starts to spiral out. Just booting the game lets you know that the atmosphere is going to be oppressive. These slightly interactive cutscenes appear between nights. You're in the place of Freddy, and Bonnie and Chica stare at you, the puppet stares at you. Funny! But before we delve into that pit of insanity, let's do the easy part and pick through these phone calls. The first night gives us the phone guy asking us to plunge our head in the sand and forget about an old location that was left to rot. This would seemingly imply the restaurant from FNAF 1, but that's something we're going to start being skeptical of very quickly. Aside from the mechanics and aforementioned recognition tech, we've got nothing else to cover here. Moving on to night 2, phone guy says the old models are being used for spare parts. While originally they were to be updated with new ones, they just came across as too ugly and smelled too bad to be put to good use. Thus, the toy animatronics were made instead. After professing his undying love for Foxy and expressing a distrust in the puppet, phone guy ends the call. Okay, sure. Night 3 is dedicated mostly to talking about the Mangle, which is the toy equivalent of Foxy, which kids kept pulling apart until the company just kinda gave up on it, hence the name. He also makes vague mentions about rumors going around about the company lately and denies that anything unusual has been going on behind the scenes. His tune changes slightly on night 4, however, when he admits an investigation is ongoing and may lead to a temporary precautionary closure of the establishment, even if it is just for a few days. The company is still denying any wrongdoing, but he tells us to be extra careful, as some of the animatronics seem to have been tampered with and are acting far more aggressive toward adult staff members, while being just fine around children. Let's stop here for a second so I can tell you something you probably already know. The check you receive at the end of night 5 says that the year is 1987, which, as you may remember, was the year of the biting incident mentioned in passing in FNAF 1. This obviously means FNAF 2, despite all the misdirection, is a prequel to the first game. The most important piece of information to note being that the missing children's incident is still ongoing at this stage. Staff doesn't take it too seriously at first, but it keeps going and becoming more of a growing concern as the nights go on. This finally ties us back back into what's presented in the death minigames, of which there are 4 in total. The first has you playing as a Freddy-looking figure, taking cake to 6 children. A lone child stands outside, crying, as a large purple car pulls up. A strange figure of the same hue gets out, evidently killing the crying child, before getting back in the car and driving away. During all of this, you can hear the phrase, "save him," being spelled out, as the player's movement speed gradually decreases and you are jump-scared by the puppet, ending the minigame. Nothing big-brained to decipher, this is just reflecting how the killer has been at work in secret underneath everyone's noses. The next has you playing as Foxy, running out of Pirate Cove to greet 5 excited children. You are made to repeat this action, but encounter the Purple Man alongside 5 dead children this time, and it ends with Foxy's jump scare. Again, nothing to write home about. The third one is likely the most important. Given control of the puppet, we're instructed to give gifts to 4 slumped-over corpses. Once all of the gifts are delivered, the message changes to "give life," whereupon the heads of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy are placed upon the children. During the segment, the words "help them" are spelled out, and the minigame ends with Golden Freddy's jump scare, though not before you can see a 5th corpse briefly appear in the middle of the room. This is a massive implication, as it suggests the puppet is somehow responsible for ensuring that the withered animatronics became haunted by the 5 victims of the missing children's incident. Though of course whether this means the puppet itself is also haunted is something that in this entry remains to be seen. Finally, we have the Save Them minigame, aptly nicknamed because of the message repeatedly spelled out as you play it. You lead Freddy around what looks like the FNAF 2 pizzeria after the puppet. You find 5 corpses along the way, and the room you start off in is often randomized. You can find the toy animatronics by wandering around, follow the puppet until you get to a certain room and end the minigame, find Golden Freddy by chance, or you can encounter the Purple Man, who upon touching you ends the minigame forcibly and gives a reply to that constant plea the minigame is named after. You can't. This doesn't tell us much new, but it is still haunting, and clearly solidifies the Purple Man's role as a visual stand-in for the killer. Purple Guy himself has become something of a meme, but representing him in such a vague way is actually incredibly clever in keeping him mysterious and eerie. You know he's out there, you just don't know who he is or why he's doing this. All of this does add up to confirming the possession angle, but it still doesn't answer everything. And unless we take Phone Guy's explanation that the toy animatronics were tampered with at complete face value, it also doesn't explain why they're trying to kill us, unless of course the Save Them minigame indeed is portraying the FNAF 2 location, which I guess means the killer mowed down double the amount of kids that we first thought, but considering a later image in the series, I'm conflicted about this thought as well.
Last year, Purple Guy claimed to have killed 5 children. This year, he claims to have killed 10. Which is it, Scott? Better keep your story straight.
My best guess would be that the initial spirits are just influencing the toys somehow, but this isn't ever explicitly followed up on, so who knows. Roundabouting our way back to the phone call, starting with night 5, Phone Guy says the building is on lockdown and nobody is allowed in or out, particularly previous employees. He also says the player character may be moved to the day shift soon, as a position just became available. Yeah. Looks like the company's internal investigation already has people pointing fingers at staff, which makes a lot of sense considering the stories from the newspapers in FNAF 1. Didn't it say something about someone using a suit to lure the children? Who else but an employee could easily access something like that? He also says they're in the middle of trying to track down the owner of the original restaurant, which was a place called Fredbear's Family Diner, though evidently it's been closed for years. In the second entry of this series, we already have 3 locations on our hands. We have the original one from FNAF 1, which could have been the old location, or it could have been a different, entirely separate one. We have the FNAF 2 location, which is the subject of this latest grand reopening, as shown in the beginning newspaper, and now we have an origin point for the company, Fredbear's Family Diner. You see how this already becomes a bit of a headache, right? And we're not even done with the phone calls either, because while every game has a hidden 6th night you unlock for completing the main 5, this time, it has its own phone call. Phone Guy wonders what in the hell we're still hanging around for, as the place is now definitively closed down, at least for a while. What he says next is extremely revealing, so I'm just gonna play it.
Someone used one of the suits. We had a spare in the back, a yellow one. Someone used it. Now none of them are acting right.
Afterward, he tells us to take day shift the next day because there's only one birthday left on the schedule. It's our task to make sure the animatronics don't hurt anyone and to stick close to them, and he volunteers to take night shift again once the place reopens. Now we know exactly when the phone guy took the job position that got him killed before Mike. It was right after this. The bite of 87 must have also happened directly after this, as it hasn't been mentioned up until this point, but there's only one event for the year left. As for the victim, fans commonly assume it to be this game's protagonist, who is identified on his check as Jeremy Fitzgerald, though really it could have been anyone present at the birthday. Jeremy was just said to be close by, so he winds up being the usual suspect. As a result, the custom night actually has a different protagonist named Fritz Smith, but he's fired due to odor just like Mike was in his custom night, so he either wasn't underemployed for very long, or his co-staff at his location finally had enough and decided to use the killings and his horrendous musk as a scapegoat to oust him. We never figure out much about either of these guys, so they're just player vessels. On top of all this, the game has several Easter eggs that are unaccounted for as well, such as JJ, a girl version of Balloon Boy who can rarely appear under the desk, the Lisa to his Bart, if you will, shadow animatronics, strange dark figures with glowing eyes and teeth who only occasionally appear and do nothing to the player, save for possibly crashing the game, and a naked endoskeleton, which can appear and climb into the left vent from time to time. As a story, FNAF 2 feels like it's the first of many to buy into its own hype. It does a decent job of filling in some previous blanks, and it cleverly introduces some misdirection while doing so, but in its attempt to surprise players with the whole 1987 reveal, it has to jump through a lot of hoops to explain itself, and it really doesn't even answer many questions. The ending newspaper does reconcile the whole toy and withered animatronic debacle by saying the toys are being scrapped due to malfunctions, and that the withereds will be fixed for a smaller scale reorganization in the future, but aside from that, the plot is still hanging around up in the air. We now know that the killer is likely someone in the company at least, and that they're capable of tampering with the animatronics directly in order to sow chaos. We don't know precisely how many victims there are now though, as the whole deal with the toys and how long the incidents have been occurring, not to even mention the puppet, means we're looking at give or take 1 to possibly 6 more children being killed than we originally suspected. It could just be the original 5 plus the puppet if the toys and Balloon Boy aren't possessed, but we don't know that for certain. FNAF 2 does a decent job at doing some world building, but in the process of fleshing out what came before, it really throws a wrench in it logistically. And while adding context can enrich the narrative, it also runs the risk of making it too unfocused for its own good.
Well, surely the next game will keep things cohesive, right? Right?
Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was once again released 4 months after the previous game.
We can't keep getting away with this.
This one takes a much different direction in how its story unfurls and how it plays. The game takes place a whopping 30 years after the final closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The missing children's incident has become nothing but a horrific whisper in the wind, until some, I don't know, true crime podcasters or something, decided it'd be a really cool, tasteful idea to open a horror attraction based on these real-life murders called Fazbear's Fright. Imagine if somebody made a Bobby Dunbar fishing attraction, like seriously? While they have basically nothing to show but some cobbled together parts and spooky memorabilia on the first night, by the time the second rolls around, they've found one. A real one. And this funny fellow, referred to as Springtrap, is the only animatronic you're going to be dealing with for the entirety of this game. Or, well, true to as they say, the only real one. Think that makes it any easier? You poor son of a bitch. The whole gameplay loop has a similar philosophy to what's come before, but how you go about it is completely different, and by different, I mean bad. I'm sorry, I really don't like the gameplay of FNAF 3. So you're locked in here with Springtrap the entire night, and he'll steadily advance towards your office through the halls or through the vents. The only way to deter him is by either locking vent doors individually, or playing Balloon Boy sound cues in specific rooms to lure him further away from you. All the while, you'll be occasionally faced with malfunctions in your already terrible cameras, your audio lures, or the ventilation, the latter of which causes you to hallucinate and may lead you to getting jump scared by phantom animatronics, which not only cause a loud ruckus that makes you a sitting duck, but will usually take out more systems in their wake. To reboot those systems, you'll have to use the maintenance panel, which takes ages and can't be navigated away from until it's finished, meaning it's even more likely that the Exorcist Bunny will drop in for a chat.
Shut up! What?
Excuse me, can I borrow some money?
In short, it's a mess. Feels like the guy's AI just goes wherever it feels like, which might be used to supplant difficulty from the previous games, but still sucks. It's way more of a crapshoot than the other entries, and while the aesthetic is cool and Springtrap's design is unironically one of maybe the best horror mascots in the past 10 years, this is on the lower end of FNAF games for me. Tearing into the putrid meat of this story is a matter all of its own. You see, FNAF 3 has a story, but in order to achieve the good ending, yes, there are multiple endings this time, you have to discover several hidden mini-games, all of which have the most cryptic entry requirements humanly possible. Before we get into those though, ring ring, hello? Oh look, it's more phone calls. Let's slow our roll and take this piecemeal. There's plenty to talk about. Before the action starts, we have to contend with the phone dude.
Word up!
Nicknamed for his notorious surferisms, before he bails out and leaves us with several nights of phone guy ASMR in the form of archived employee training tapes. Their plot relevance this go-around being that he talks all about the operation of mascot costumes, particularly springlock suits, which act as hybrid animatronics and costumes. The idea is that the springlocks can be shifted to accommodate for a performer whenever they'd like to move around in a way that would be impossible for just the robot to better interact with the children. As you may suspect, this is heavily implied to be the method used by the killer in order to lure children during the missing children's incident. Why this specific information is important, however, is related to a warning the phone guy gives about keeping the springlocks fastened tightly, because if they aren't, said springlocks can break loose while the suit is being worn, shoving all of the mechanical devices back into place and promptly crushing the person inside of it. The company even specifically suggests anyone who has made this mistake should navigate away from the people to bleed out so as not to ruin the fun for everybody.
Looks like the real phantoms were the lingering remnants.
She did it, everybody! She said the secret word!
On night 4, we learn the springlock suits were promptly decommissioned due to an incident at a sister location involving several simultaneous failures, meaning that the suits will all be retired and looked at by technicians. On night 5, he mentions a safe room reserved both for storage and emergencies where no customer should ever be taken. Considering this is about as private as the place gets, and he also mentions a spring Bonnie costume being moved, take a wild guess as to who our lurking guest is in the modern day. Finally, the Night 6 call details how the safe rooms will be sealed at most locations due to budgetary constraints. The perfect place to be discovered by information-hungry scavengers running a tacky horror attraction in the future. And here's where the minigames come into play. At the end of each night, you're thrust into a few low-res walking simulators that you do regardless of whatever else. These involve following this shadow animatronic through a safe room where Purple Guy hits you with psionic waves and tears the respective animatronic apart. To get the good ending, we need to refrain from hitting the Night 5 minigame until we do the extras. The requirements to get into these range from easy enough, like double-clicking the drawing of Balloon Boy on Cam 8, to cryptic, like clicking on the arcade machine buttons on Cam 7 in a certain order, to downright baffling, like treating 9 clickable wall tiles in the office like it is a phone dial pad and punching in a specific number combination. This reads like instructions from an r/Ambien post. Most of these minigames have you collecting and delivering cake as various characters, leading to the Happiest Day minigame, where if you've completed all the others, you can control the puppet and place a cake on the table near 5 children, all wearing masks of the original game's animatronics, including Golden Freddy. There are a few other kids in a different set of animatronic masks that we won't be catching around again for a few games yet. Once you wrap up all your business, the kids' bodies will disappear, the masks falling to the ground as 6 balloons float out of view. This finally unlocks the good ending, which comes after the final night minigame. Here, instead of controlling an animatronic, we control a crying ghost child, like the one seen in the FNAF 2 death minigames. Approaching the safe room past the destroyed animatronics, we come face to face with Purple Guy, who is downright flabbergasted to see his victims up and about. In an attempt to regain control, he quickly skitters into the Spring Bonnie suit, the avatar of these children's suffering, but in a twist of cosmic irony, he jostles the springlocks inside the suit in his haste, leading to them crunching in and leaving him to slowly bleed out. Satisfied with his punishment, the spirits of the children fade away. If you get the bad ending, you'll see the animatronic heads with still lit eyes, signaling that their souls are not yet at peace, though with the good ending, the eyes are hollow, meaning everything is finally over. For the first trilogy. The ending newspaper scrap tells us that Fazbear's fright went up in smoke, burning to the ground due to faulty wiring, and apparently sealing Springtrap within the flames where he rightfully belongs. Adjusting the contrast on the image, however, shows that he's still limping along somewhere, and will make his return eventually. After all, he always comes back. Yeah, there, it said the line. Are you happy? Let's succinctly sum up what just happened. Springtrap is carrying the corpse of Purple Guy, who used the company's safe rooms and the Spring Bonnie costume for his plan to string together the corpses of dead children like the world's worst paper doll chain. After doing this for a while, endangering the company, getting a couple locations shut down, and hiding his evidence inside the FNAF 1 crew, those animatronics caught ghostioperosis and started walking around. Evidently perturbed by having to face down his misdeeds, Purple Guy sets about trying to whack them in the knees hard enough that they go to heaven, but all this actually did was release their pissed off ghosts, which scared him into a corner. Thinking he could get the one-up by jump scaring them himself, he makes an itsy-bitsy huge f*** up and gets himself bone crunched by the highly unsafe suits the guys up the ladder just got done saying were prone to killing people. Afterward, the safe rooms were sealed up, his body was left to rot, the incidents went unsolved and became legend, and a bunch of opportunistic numbskulls decades down the line discovered his withering carcass and set him loose into a grimy enclosure where he's forced to walk around like a feral, bloodthirsty dog until the place rightly went up in flames. He sucks so bad, it's great. FNAF 3 is messy as hell as a game, but taking the story on its own merits, it's a rather satisfying conclusion, if it had ever really been a conclusion. The steady realization over the course of the nights, with context clues being delivered via training tapes and secrets, and Springtrap himself being a Frankenstein of the original monster who started it all, is a really cool narrative device. This is probably the closest FNAF has ever come to delivering a really effective horror narrative up until this point. The first game is cool, but it's bare bones. The second filled out some background details, but created more problems than it solved. This, though, it establishes a fantastic atmosphere from the get-go, feeds you mysteries, and then, well, look at the aptly titled minigame. It actually gives you answers. Thank God. In retrospect, Springtrap becomes an even more terrifying antagonist, his shitty jump scare notwithstanding, because his actions are now less random to parse, and it only makes them creepier. He's a silent, lumbering menace, just like the other animatronics before him, but he feels far more like a malicious presence. We know his crimes, and whatever instinct remains in him still wants blood. We still have to lure him away from us with the sounds of a child. What a perfect creepazoid. He's awful, he's spine-chilling, he's a fantastic villain. Everybody give it up for the purpliest dude who ever erpled. At the end of this baby barf green-tinted rodeo, we don't know everything, but what we do know gives us enough insight into the methods behind the madness of this story's star player. And with desserts of both kinds delivered to those who rightfully deserve them, it's like closure is just over the horizon for Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Well, credit where it's due, this one came out 4 months after the previous one, so actually nothing has changed.
But this one is being marketed as the final chapter. Well, you know, we all believe our own lies sometimes.
FNAF 4 is unique among its roster in that it actually doesn't have any spoken lines of dialogue at all. No phone calls, no audio logs. Most of the story we salvage from this game comes entirely from the now staple minigames sprinkled between each night. The game itself is very different from any that came previously, too, putting us in the shoes of a frightened child fending off nightmarish versions of the animatronics alone at home at night. While people can argue any which way about this, there's a simple call to make. This stuff isn't real, but rather is a literal nightmare being experienced by this child. It's mechanically stronger than the prior two due to its pointed return to simplicity, requiring you to dart between 2 bedroom doors, a closet, and your bed, listening for breathing to shut out any looming animatronics trying to breach you. Shining your light while breathing is going to mean you'll most likely be jump scared, so you've really got to listen closely, which means you need pretty high volume and likely headphones, which obviously means you'll have your ears blasted out if you screw up. But this rockets up the tension something fierce, which makes for a good balance because aesthetically, this game is lacking to me. Love the tratty 80s house, but even with the excuse that the nightmare animatronics aren't actually real and are just hyper-maximalist figments of a scared kid's mind, they're too over the top to be sincerely scary to me, so all of the silent tension and sound work is what's making them worth being scared of. As for those minigames, strap in because oh boy, are we about to go places. Pizza places. Each minigame counts us down for 5 days until some party, and puts us in control of who is presumably this game's protagonist, only referred to as the Crying Child, because he stubs his toe a lot and he just can't take it anymore. The Crying Child is accompanied by a plush Fredbear of Fredbear's Family Diner fame, who comfortingly speaks to him and promises he will be there. The first minigame has Cece locked in his room, which Fredbear attributes to some mysterious hymn before the child curls up and cries on the ground, after pounding on the door, after which the plush says, "Tomorrow is another day." With 4 days left until the party, we can wander the house, which allows you to see what is presumably a girl's room. Huh. I wonder if she's also got problems and issues. Ultimately though, the minigame ends when you approach the television and get jump scared by the crying child's older brother wearing a foxy mask. This establishes a couple of important things. 2 brothers, 1 sister, and the TV program Fredbear and Friends, which you can spot on the television, alludes to the year being 1983. Okay, so working under the pretense that this isn't just a rerun, we're early on in the restaurant's history, before Purple Guy goes on his first of many little murdercations. We also know that this crying child is deathly afraid of the franchise's lovable Freddy Squad, and if he's going to be having a party soon, one can probably guess where it's going to be, much to his chagrin. His brother doesn't seem to be making it any easier.
Or maybe he just likes dressing up as Foxy and practicing his jump scare noises. I don't judge.
With 3 days left until the party, the child is at the diner where the Fredbear plush instructs you to leave, since you've been left behind and he knows you hate it here. Darting every which way, you can see someone in the Fredbear suit, the shadow of a Spring Bonnie suit, and also, oh, hey Purple Guy, putting a costume head onto an employee. This confirms that even if he's not active yet, he is definitely at the company in its formative days, which means he's involved with it somewhat deeply. Sadly, the sopping wet sobber can't find his way out, crying under a table. Tomorrow is yet another day. 2 days until the party. This one is eventful. The Fredbear plush once again urges us to get out, and this time we actually do, the madman. On the way back home, we can interact with several kids. One has a Spring Bonnie plush, who they say is a finger trap according to their dad. There's also a girl with pigtails who, let's say, has a sadistic streak, since she basically just tells the crying child that the animatronics will come to life at night and hide his corpse. What did she mean by that? Does she know something? A third child taunts him for crying so much, and finally, a fourth taunts him for being required to go to the party since it's for his birthday. Wow, these neighborhood kids suck. I'd uninvite them from all of my birthday parties if I could. Once again, trudging through to the house, the child is jump scared by his foxy mask wearing big brother, this time from under the bed. Curling up and crying, the Fredbear plush says his favorite catchphrase and promises that tomorrow will be another day. Yeah, another shitty day. What's your point? 1 day until the party, the child has been locked up in the spare parts room. Happens all the time. He screams for help, begging to be let out before doing what he does best, curling up into a ball and crying. I'm starting to feel glad this fanbase is full of children. I'd hate to see people compare this poor toddler to Shinji Ikari. Tomorrow is not another day though. Ominous. Wonder if something's going to happen. It's party day. The child's older brother and his friends are giving him the old birthday slap special as usual before they decide to surround and lift him, bringing him up near Fredbear and further teasing him for his fears. They talk about forcing him to give Fredbear a big kiss, but here's where they screw up. They get him too close in the mouth. And these stupid kids don't know what happens when you get those spring locks wet.
Great!
Yeah, they got his head crunched. Judging by that crunching sound and their horrified faces, I don't think he's coming back from it. This leads us to our final minigame after the extra night 6. The crying child sits alone in a void with the Fredbear plush and plushes of the other original gang, and some very revealing text follows. First, it's in a different color than the Fredbear plush's text, which I think is implying it's from the older brother.
Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me. I'm sorry.
Then, Fredbear speaks up again.
You're broken. We are still your friends. Do you still believe that? I'm still here. I will put you back together.
In the end, we can hear the sound of a flatlining heart monitor, and I'm sure you don't need a doctor to tell you what that means. If it wasn't clear enough, there's also a 1 in 100 chance that during gameplay, you can see one of 3 visuals when turning back toward the child's bed: a vase of flowers, a pill bottle, and an IV drip. If the animatronics are the child's nightmares, then what we're playing through are his vivid, fear-driven visions as he lays dying in the hospital, a result of this horrible incident spurred by childish negligence and cruelty. The crying child is no more, and may have been the first great tragedy of the Fazbear brand, but how does this tie into everything else? How is this meant to be seen as the final chapter? Well, while I do think a lot of this stuff does resonate, it's hard to figure out how until later, which already defeats the purpose of giving it that final chapter moniker, doesn't it? As the second choice of 3 different conclusions, I'd say FNAF 4 succeeds the least at what it's going for, unfortunately. As a stepping stone to the rest of the story as Scott Cawthon decided it, however, it comes across well enough. Even more mysterious too is the ending of the Nightmare mode, Night 7, which brings us to this mysterious gray lockbox, which cannot be opened by any means. Trying only gives us this text. Perhaps some things are best left forgotten, for now. There's a lot of speculation about what's in this damn thing, and for being so hidden away, it never really comes up again. Personally, I think its elusive meaning is entirely metaphorical, a simple representation of Scott's original thoughts of how he wanted the series to go, left sitting there for him to know, and for us to never find out. And I really do applaud Scott for bringing an emotional element to this story. It works surprisingly well, even if its ties to the rest of the material seem tenuous at best until later. The gameplay got back to the raw, preservation-driven horror that made the first game so good, and made the other two way too complicated for their own good. FNAF 4 walks a delicate line between being the last truly great game in this era of the series in my mind, as well as signifying quite a bit of missed potential. It was supposed to bring us closure, but much like an older brother haunted by the sins he's committed, we're not going to be sleeping soundly with what we know now. Not until we can find a better form of closure, that is. It's no secret that Scott kept pumping away at these sequels because, as many creators are, he was unsatisfied with his work. He meant for FNAF 3 to be the end, but poor reception, particularly toward its scare factor, meant he wanted to end things off on a better note, and complaints about FNAF 4 further inspired him to revoke his claims about it being the final entry in the series. But this go around, he wanted to come back with something very different, and to his credit, he sure did.
But first, do you like RPGs?
This is the part where I must regretfully mention FNAF World, a chibi-fied RPG spin-off Scott released in January of 2016. Then again in February because, people did not like that first release a whole lot. The game itself has a couple of interesting tidbits about various characters, but it's largely spin-off fodder to a T. It might as well be FNAF shovelware. The only compelling slice of it comes from its hidden ending, featuring this desk guy. It mostly serves as a teaser for what would become the next major installment in the series, Five Nights at Freddy's sister location. The man at the desk alludes to the creation of a horrible creature named Baby who will screw everything up. He's been stressed to the bone worrying about people's expectations and scolds us for getting too deep into this mess, before he's slapped dead by the mysterious Baby. Her eyes glow in the dark as she breaks character and just tells us to go to Steam and buy sister location, which loops back into making sense as it would come out the same year in October of 2016. Hey, look at that, this game took over a year to come out after FNAF 4. Scothy's learning to show some restraint, in a manner of speaking. Sister Location outright ditches a lot of the conventions of the series up until now. The nasty, disease-ridden attractions you're used to white knighting for has been traded in for cramped metal corridors and the abstract minigame segments within. Each night is a segment all of its own, complete with its own mechanics and even actual scenes with voice acting for the characters. This marks a massive turning point in the franchise, as up until this point, the only voiced characters were people like Phone Guy, which was just Scott talking normally. Now, we've got talking animatronics with silly voices. The game takes place at an unspecified time, though it has to be sometime after Freddy's is opened. The location? Circus Baby's entertainment and rental. As opposed to the regular Fazbear brand animatronics who loiter around the restaurant, the ones here are kept in underground storage, a sprawling robotics factory where they're rented out for private parties and get operated on during the night to keep them in top shape. As we can see from the intro, the place has been founded and got its animatronics designed by a posh-sounding British gent named Mr. Afton. We can't actually get this guy's first name from the games here, so for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to call him by his actual name, which is Matthew Lillard.
It's a circus, baby!
Which is William Afton. As for who he is, well, just know that he made this place and its cast of characters. The unlucky sap we're playing as has an identity we'll be able to figure out later too, but for now, let's focus on the action. Night 1 sees us being instructed by our helpful hand unit to go to the control module between the showrooms to administer some controlled shocks to the Funtime animatronics, to get them all to return to their stages. Most of them do, but not all. We stroll on over to the auditorium to administer shocks to Circus Baby, the primary animatronic of the joint, before crawling back out of the vent and leaving. Every night back at their home, our protagonist unwinds with a schlocky Newgrounds animated romantic drama about a vampire and his human wife while eating popcorn. Hey, I won't begrudge the guy his vices.
It's the little things in life, you know?
Night 2 sees us returning to the zapping routine, but shakes things up with the hand unit deciding to do an angsty teen voice. It also tells us that a dead body was found in the vent once, which we can only hope have been cleaned. When we go to zap Baby again, the power goes goes out, and while the service is offline trying to fix itself, we get to talk with the star player herself.
It's a strange thing to want to do, to come here. I'm curious what events would lead a person to want to spend their nights in a place like this. Willingly. Maybe curiosity, maybe ignorance.
In any case, Baby doesn't kill us like you might assume someone of her metallic persuasion would be interested in. Robophobe. Instead, she instructs us to hide in a cubby beneath the desk from strange doll-like figures trying to pry it open and get to us. We have to avoid eye contact with them, but eventually they leave. Baby then tells us when Hand Unit comes back online that he will try to trick us into crawling through Ballora Gallery to reach the breaker, at which point we'll be killed by the titular dancer. She gives us the advice to go slowly, listen carefully, and stop when she gets too close. This advice allows us to get through unscathed, at which point we can reset the breaker, but not without some trouble from the encroaching Funtime Freddy and his hand puppet Bon Bon, who we need to remain aware of while working and disconnect from the terminal if they get too close. After we succeed in getting everything up and running again, we can finally exit and get some sleep for the night. Well, that's odd, isn't it? Seems like Baby just saved our skin there, twice for that matter. She speaks in such a calm, relaxed manner, indicating a certain level of friendliness, despite how her cadence strays into the uncanny valley.
Hello, my name is Princess Jane.
There's an interesting back and forth to this dynamic where one moment she seems trustworthy, but the next can seem suspicious and frightening. After hearing the voice of a little British girl begging her dad to play with Circus Baby, who she says was made just for her, we begin the third night. We open with a significant paydock and some conciliatory bongos. Aw man, these don't even have any GameCube connectivity, you cheap motherfucker. The bulk of this night is spent avoiding Funtime Foxy in the pitch black using a flash beacon to occasionally orient ourselves. Screw that. And in Parts and Service, where we're required to get power modules from both Funtime Freddy and Bon Bon, doing things in a specific order so that they'll stay depowered all during our little game of operation and won't scream us into our grave.
What are those Neanderthals up to? Don't they know I'm busy spoiling myself?
One important thing to note before the night is wrapped is that you can get some secret dialogue from Baby. Heading back to the hidey hole under the desk from night 2, she regales us about the one time she was on stage, during which children would constantly cycle in and out of the room while music played somewhere down the hall. Baby notes that for some reason, she was always acutely aware of how many children were in the room with her, constantly counting until just one was around. With the one child alone, Baby went to offer her ice cream from a latch in her stomach, but when she stepped closer, Baby suddenly could not move. She heard screaming for just a moment before the other children came back, unable to hear the girl's screams over their horsing around.
I still hear her sometimes. Why did that happen?
This makes some pretty heavy implications, considering the bits of dialogue we hear between nights of the little girl. One thing that this makes immediately clearer, though, is how genuinely pitiable Baby seems. She too seems haunted by the lingering will of a child abandoned to their fate, but the circumstances feel stranger than usual, and more than that, she's having the struggle of identity relating to her own individual will, which is now forever baked into her very core. That gentle, almost innocently curious question of, why did that happen, never fails to send a shiver down my spine. It communicates just how deeply scarring this experience was for it to still bother her so long after the fact. The animatronics have always been unfortunate figures, despite how scary they are, because the idea that they're encasing trapped souls who did nothing worth being put in this position is so deeply tragic. But Baby is the first time I've seen this beat acted upon directly, and I have to give it props. Anyway, after we complete our task for the night, we have to head back through the Murdertorium, and this time we aren't so lucky. Inevitably, you get jump-scared by Funtime Foxy, but instead of dying, we fade to black and awaken within a spring-locked suit. The cameras have been searching for us all night, but Baby has kidnapped us, with no ill intentions, she says. Well, that's reassuring. According to her, the suit we're in is just barely big enough to fit us, and we shouldn't move around much unless we want to get our ribs splayed out. She also says this came from her old pizzeria, and that the Circus Baby restaurant was only briefly open, and that it was never used.
At least not the way it was meant to be used.
We're in the scooping room, which is aptly titled due to it being where a device called the Scooper is located. Here's where Baby's dialogue starts to become gradually a little more suspicious. Before this point, she's been both tragic and awkwardly personable, seemingly helpful if in a creepy way. Now though, her tone starts to become eerie, if not outright malicious, just barely hidden beneath her usual pleasantries. Beyond whispering proudly about the fact that she's kidnapped us and scaring us about the springlock suit, she also says this.
Do you know why they call it the scooping room? It's because, dummy, this is the room where they use the scooper. I thought that would be obvious.
By itself, it's just a little dry humor, but considering how ginger she's sounded up until this point, it's a notable contrast. It's like she's realized something between the start of the game and now that's made her reevaluate her opinion of us. Her genuine concern has warped into a desire to see us squirm, vague though her larger intentions may be for the moment. After we see Ballora wheeled by, broken down by some workers, Baby tells us ominously that the most important thing she's learned to do over time is to pretend, to play make-believe, and to act one way when you're really the other.
It's very important,
she says.
Ballora never learns. But I do.
After this, we see Ballora appear to get destroyed by something, and the springlock suit opens up. From here, we need to wait to be noticed on the cameras, after which we can be bailed out. Until then, we need to micromanage the spring locks and keep them wound up, otherwise they'll jut out and turn us into purple fillet. All the while, we have to gently jostle the plates to prevent these little marionettes, mini-renas, from getting inside the suit and swarming us, which is deeply unsettling. Thanks for the nightmare fuel, Scottsdale. As I understand it, this bit was so difficult, it actually had to be patched pretty soon after the game's release.
I've got a couple of murderous miniatures in my socks, but at least I can watch Hotel Transylvania in peace.
The final line we get from the little girl between nights is that Daddy isn't watching, in case that non-sequitur story from Baby wasn't quite heavy-handed enough, and we finally begin night 5. We're being given a gift basket, whose cost is being taken out of our check. Okay. And we've got to do a cursory checkup on the animatronics, as usual. Nobody's around, and we've got maintenance to do on Baby this time. She's been deactivated, and she interrupts to give us the scoop. No, not that one. She says she's pretending not to be operational because something bad happened the day prior, and she doesn't want it to happen again. She's to be taken to the scooping room soon, but it won't fix what's wrong with her. What's bad is always left behind, she says. She wants us to help remove the bad and save the good, but we have to be careful because Ballora is nearby and won't return to her body. Whatever that means. Taking a small card we can find in one of Baby's hatches, we follow her directions through the auditorium, using the card to continue listening to her while sending her body to the scooping room. Navigating through the dark with her instructions, we make it there and learn what a huge mistake we just made. Yeah, Baby was pretending, both to be on our side as well as even being Baby in the first place. Everyone has been to the scooping room today, and what's been commanding us has been a massive collective of all the animatronics funneled into one, commanded primarily by Baby's consciousness. They've tried multiple times to escape the underground complex and into the outside world, but for years they've always been left alone in the dark. With our arrival, they could play the long con to gain our trust and eventually betray us. Why? So they can use the scooper to literally hollow us out and wear us as a big flesh puppet so they can pretend to be human and go outside. As Baby puts it,
if we looked like you, then we would have somewhere to go. The scooper only hurts for a moment.
And predictably, we are scooped. We hear the little girl's voice talking to Baby, asking where all the other children went, as we see our suspiciously Rick Ashley-shaped protagonist limp in front of a bathroom mirror. Opening his eyes, we see they've been replaced by glowing animatronic ones, drenched in purple hue. But that's not actually the end of Sister Location. We've got some extra content to cover, which helps us avert our fate. Sort of. There's the classic death minigames, which sees us delivering cupcakes to children as Baby. The time limit and cupcake amount is super strict, but if you manage to pull it off, you'll see a little girl with red hair walking up to Baby, being offered ice cream from a claw extending from her stomach. When she goes to take it, the claw juts out, grabs the child, and the screen goes black with a horrible scream. This confirms that the little girl we heard, the one partially haunting Baby, was killed by her, and given the questions of the technicians to Mr. Afton at the start of the game, we know that these animatronics were designed specifically to do this. Kidnapping and killing children when they were alone, hence why Baby's programming made her distinctly aware of how many were in the room at one time. The little girl, however, was told frequently by her dad, who dedicated the animatronic to her, not to go near it or be alone with it. Given her voice, we can assume she's related to Mr. Afton, meaning she was his daughter. And considering the guy made these things to do what they do, it's not hard to assume who William really is. He's Purple Guy, he's the killer. And though he was already killing kids for whatever reason before this, his own daughter got caught in the crossfire. And that's not the end of it. The other hidden content gives us a different ending in the form of a keycard we acquire from finishing this other stuff. Once we reach the point where Baby guides us through the dark, we have to deliberately ignore her requests and head right. Coming up on a secret observation room, here we'll play a round of the original FNAF-style tower defense gameplay, fending off the amalgamated jester called Ennard. In the office, we also see the Fredbear plush from FNAF 4, and can even see the house layout from FNAF 4 on the monitors if we punch in a specific code.
I wouldn't think William would need to remember what his own house looks like. Doesn't he live there?
All the while, Baby questions us, asking why we didn't trust her, telling us that they need to get out and won't get another chance, and directly confronts the protagonist, saying,
"Isn't this why you came here? To be with her again?"
When we finally finish the night, she declares she will find a way out, and upon returning home, we find that Ennard has followed us there, presumably intending to kill us in a manner far more painful than any scooper could. This, however, is referred to as the fake ending, so even though it gives us a few more puzzle pieces to work with, the outcome is ultimately the same. Our protagonist gets ripped into and used as fresh meat for Ennard's human Sona. This leads us to the Custom Night DLC, an entire typical FNAF-style mode where each animatronic is included and has their own programmed behaviors. Practically its own entire subgame rolled into this one. Predictably, it also has its own hidden content to talk about, and it will help us see Sister Location through to its true ending. At the end of each successful challenge run, we get death game style cutscenes of a guy in a purple shirt walking down the street and past enthusiastically waving neighbors. With each iteration of the scene, he becomes sicker. The people grow more concerned until he is a shambling purple corpse. At the end of this, he becomes so bad that everyone is hiding from him, presumably because of his odor, and he collapses onto the street, vomiting a mess of animatronic parts into the sewer. We hear Baby's voice reiterating the line, "You won't die," as the corpse somehow reanimates and stands back up, with the eyes lighting up in the sewer. This shows us that our strange undead friend is the game's protagonist post-scoopdom, and for whatever reason, when Ennard escapes from his body and into the sewers, he doesn't go limp. And at the end of our challenges, we finally learn who said protagonist is, and, well, I'll just let it play.
Father, it's me, Michael. I did it. I found it. It was right where you said it would be. They were all there. They didn't recognize me at first, but then they thought I was you. And I found her. I put her back together, just like you asked me to. She's free now. But something is wrong with me. I should be dead, but I'm not. I've been living in shadows. There is only one thing left for me to do now. I'm going to come find you. I'm going to come find you.
Oh boy, okay, let's dissect that. First of all, Britain. The protagonist is Michael, and he's talking to his father. When he proclaims that he's coming to find William, we see Springtrap arise from the ruins of the burned-down Fazbear's Fright from FNAF 3, not only confirming that he's still around, but that he is certainly William Afton. Purple Guy, Springtrap, William Afton, whatever you want to call him, they're one and the same, and the girl inhabiting Baby, as well as this guy Michael, who is the protagonist of Sister Location, are his children. But they can't be the only ones. Think about it. Why is the Fredbear plush in the hidden office? Why are there cameras set up to monitor the FNAF 4 house? Well, yeah, it's William's house. Which means, of course, that the kids featured in FNAF 4 are his kids. That empty girl's room, it belongs to the girl who inhabits Baby. The older brother, Foxy McPrank, that's obviously Michael. So then, where does the younger brother come in? Well, we know the killings didn't start until after he was bitten and killed by accident, and oh dear. A few of these implications still aren't entirely clear to us, but this puts a lot into perspective, doesn't it? Michael says he was instructed by his father to come to this place, find Baby, and put her back together. The title, Sister Location, isn't strictly about this being a spin-off of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It's literally the location of Michael's sister. It's almost stupid how easy this is to miss. When Michael first arrives, Baby doesn't recognize him, and it's implied that due to the many years she spent locked up, she's gone a wee bit stir-crazy. Determined to escape up to the surface and not all there anymore, she takes a little while to recognize her brother, and even when she does, it's questionable whether she actually does. Remember, Michael says that they thought he was his father. Baby Soul, the girl, was killed when she was small, meaning Michael was still probably a child too. Decades have passed, Michael is an adult now, and his resemblance to his father may be strong enough that she genuinely didn't realize, at least not immediately, that he wasn't William himself. Knowing that, for whatever reason, Michael would survive his encounter with the Scooper, she went ahead with her plan to trick him into stealing his body. This works and Ennard escapes, but Michael still gets up, now vowing to come find his father, who he hasn't seen since he was younger. Sister Location is, as I would describe it, the best, worst FNAF game. It has a lot of deeply compelling elements, but it also marks the beginning of many trends in the series that I would come to dislike. This story is genuinely heartrending. A brother consumed by his past trauma, his mistakes, and his need to make up for it, following the orders of a father who is a genuine monster, trying to salvage the remaining family relationships he has, only to discover his beloved sister has morphed into a hollow shell of her former self. A voice that speaks comfortingly to him when it's convenient, and then reveals it was all an act to hurt and betray him. His sister is still here, but in many ways, she was also lost, to Baby, to herself, and to the deeply scarring events that derailed both their young lives in the first place. This thing slinks around, calling to him in her own voice, demanding to be let in, but it's all for its own gain. It asks Michael if he came here to be with her, and in many respects that's true. How deeply, personally terrifying must that be? This is putting the idea of being haunted by your past to new extremes, and that is what I love about this game. Sister Location is so much more of a personal narrative than any the series has had so far, and it's emotionally taxing because of it. I love that because it gives context to the fear, gives weight to the proceedings, in a way I struggle to imagine being done better at any other point in this series, at least in my opinion. It's a game not just about scary animatronics haunted by ghosts, but what it means to be haunted by something. To see your goodwill, your attachment, and your love turn into resentment, trauma, and suffering. It's about how families tear themselves apart under the pressure of external circumstances, and how even the most loving people can turn inward and begin hurting each other, if they're given the wrong example. But even though the storytelling has gotten stronger, the presentation has gotten lost. The varied gameplay was an admirable idea, and I can't blame Scott for trying after the formula had gotten so old. But none of these sections are particularly fun or as mechanically tight as the gameplay in previous games were. It says something that the most engaging part of Sister Location is when it's just aping the previous ones again, and for this reason it's also not nearly as replayable, becoming an easily forgotten one-time novelty in the process. While I also enjoy the added focus on the almost sardonic humor, I think it's executed perfectly fine here. This style of humor in FNAF would come to be so oversaturated that it begins to obscure the prevalence of the horror, continuing the trend of PG-13ifying the series, which I know some people don't see an issue with, but it kind of veers away from what I liked about the series to begin with, you know? This is also leaned into with the introduction of voice acting, which isn't as egregious here, but went overboard later on. All of the actors are very talented, but things like Funtime Freddy's crazy voice just don't do it for me. It's over the top in a way that I think detracts from how much scarier these guys are when they're wordless, gaudy metal death traps. The silence is imposing because it leaves you to wonder what they're thinking, if they are at all, and I find that way more frightening than someone doing a cartoon voice to subvert the scare factor. Again, no shade to the actors here. Kellen Goff in particular has done a lot of work for the series, and good on him because he is a fantastic actor. He does a perfect job at what he was being told to do, I just don't think it was entirely necessary. Save for one big exception, which is Baby. Baby's vocal performance was crucial not only in delivering a lot of the story and its nuance, but is also just a genuinely fantastic performance all around. Heather Masters flawlessly walks the tightrope between comfortingly sweet and duplicitously eerie that I could only dream of being able to pull off, and it enhances Baby's character 1,000-fold simply because of how well it captures the idea of her, and incrementally ramps up its menace in such a way that you can follow her entire arc from point A to Z without ever needing to hear her explain it. You can just feel it, and that's some serious acting chops on display. Overall, I'm mixed on Sister Location. It tips the domino in a direction I'm not particularly fond of, and its gameplay is so lukewarm that this may as well just have been an overblown side novel. But this video is about the qualities of FNAF's narrative, and in that respect, it's some of the finest work in show, if not genuinely the best. This game's the one I'll always rotate in my brain the most if I get thinking about this series. Also, bonus points, I Can't Fix You is easily the best FNAF song by The Living Tombstone.
Fight me about this if you must. you will lose.
But as you may have noticed, we've been left holding a big cliffhanger, so how does this all get resolved? Well, Junior, have you ever been interested in owning your own small business? A place where you can spread joy, make money, and get sued so much you drown in a pool of paperwork and sweat? Well, have I got the capital venture for you, my friend? Just promise me one thing. You can ignore the bodies, right? Once again, over a year later in December of 2017, Scott released Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. Things were busy in the franchise for a while, as books were being worked on, and of course, the long development hell of the FNAF movie, which had long since been picked up and tossed between studios and directors, was ongoing. Content couldn't be thrown out as fast as it was before, especially with the new entries becoming more and more experimental as they went along. Overall, it was time well spent, at the very least to ensure that there was actual innovation going on at the Freddy Faz mill. At first glance, one might not think this entry is going to be anything special, and indeed, it's deliberately framed that way. The screenshots aren't frank about the game's contents, the advertisement images on Steam all seem to be 8-bit, and the game is completely free. It looks like it's just a simple arcade-style minigame where you throw pizzas at patrons as Freddy, but that's only the first couple of minutes. Before you know it, you're given a big surprise, sitting face-to-face with a heavily damaged, scrappy-looking version of Baby at a table with a cassette player. There's a man who leads us through several audio prompts to test the animatronic's movements before Baby stops it herself, leading us to the title screen. The simulation experience of the now revealed Pizzeria Simulator at foot is pretty simple, despite its complex appearance. This is a tycoon game, through and through. Ever played Roller Coaster Tycoon, Lemonade Tycoon, Loan Shark Tycoon? Papa's Burgeria? Well then, you get the basic gist of this game. You use your carefully allocated funds during the day to set up your very own Freddy Fazbear's pizza chain location, spruce up your restaurant to make it more appealing and profitable, and take brand deals to increase your budget. After that, you give her a whirl, see the performance, and see how much cash you raked in, as well as if you've incurred any legal costs on account of the whole incredible danger. What distinguishes this game from the rest of the genre is another set of changes to the formula. First of all, there's salvaging. Every once in a while, you'll be faced with an animatronic found in the back alley that needs either to be salvaged or tossed. And salvaging it is a difficult task without getting jump scared.
You dare bring light to my lair?
You have to shock the little buggers if they get too antsy, and you know how much they like to do that. You can just throw them out if you want, but in order to get the good ending, yes, there are multiple endings in this game again, you'll have to take them all.
Don't forget Saturday. You want them all to be in one place.
This leads us to the in-between segments of the night, where you sit in your office, monitor your systems on your work computer, and do maintenance. Your maintenance work, as well as any loud advertisements that pop up if you shill to any particular brand, will alert animatronics in your events to your presence. Especially the ones you've brought in off the street, such as Molten Freddy, Scrap Baby, Lefty, and Springtrap? Oh god, what did they do to your design? He looks like he's got a potato head.
I'd say Brain Blast, but I'm not actually sure you're that smart, William.
You just have to be careful with your systems to ward them away, but this can get pretty tricky, and only gets trickier as the nights progress. And then of course there's the arcade machines, which you can test during the day and contain little mini-games. Many of them feature the Clippy-esque assistant mascot Helpy, who I can't get enough of seeing miss the ball pit. Come on, one more time. Yeah. But also sometimes contain hidden sections, which, you guessed it, expand on the lore. Oh joy. The narrative of Pizzeria Sim is told in a confusing manner, but aside from some wrenches thrown our way, it's relatively simple once you figure it out. Instead of trying to painstakingly go through all of the details in order of how and when the game presents them, I'm gonna streamline it so we have less of a collective headache. So, you remember how Sister Location ended? Ennard gets Michael scooped, Zombie Michael spits Ennard out into the sewers, Zombie Michael goes looking for William, who is Springtrap, and who survived the fire of Fazbear Frights. Okay, so now we pick up pretty far into the future again. Fazbear Entertainment has had enough of a pause to think it's a safe time to be uncancelled on Twitter, and comes back trying to wield the power of corporate nostalgia to re-establish themselves. To this end, they offer up a chain deal, and this offer is taken up by none other than Michael Afton, yet again, most likely thinking this is the most effective way to find his father. This is also likely due to your manager, the Cassette Man, who has some pretty particular contractual expectations of us that will shed more light on this whole ordeal as we go. Cassette Guy wants to lure out all of the significant lingering souls that are still out there into this new establishment. First of all, there's Molten Freddy, who is basically Ennard? Yeah, so apparently some power struggle occurred within Ennard off-screen because Baby got booted out for being a control freak, makes sense, and had to scrap herself back together with trash. Molten Freddy is the remaining Fun Times, with Funtime Freddy seemingly being the one calling the shots now. There's also something to be said about how technically Ennard Freddy is all of the souls from the previous games wrapped into one singular metal hive mind? We get this information due to a set of riddles from an upstanding gent called Candy Cadet. Gamble enough and Candy Cadet will tell you one of 3 stories, each with a common theme. 5 different objects somehow becoming one. This does a lot of legwork in explaining why Molten Freddy needs to be here in the first place, instead of just being some rogue AI. He's actually dragging all of these kids along for their above-ground joyride. As for how this works, that's its own rant. This leaves us with our other 2 guests of honor, Scrap Trap and Lefty, who we find out from its schematics is just a big container that was meant to lure and trap the puppet from FNAF 2, who winds up finally getting some much-needed background in this game. Where all of this is going in the early game is anyone's guess. Really, my mind is just caught on how funny it is to imagine Michael and William finally getting to beef with each other after all this time.
Good for nothing son says what? Father, it's just a salvage test. It's not going to kill you to be cooperative.
Well, I know it's not going to kill me. I'm already dead. Idiot.
And whose fault is that?
Well, in a manner of speaking, yours, actually.
Bullshit. How is that my fault?
Well, if you hadn't gone your jollies being a prick to your brother back in '83.
A, that was an accident. B, I failed to see how that leads to the child murder.
My methods are none of your business.
No, I kind of think they are, as a matter of fact.
Well, you know what else is a fact? You look like shit.
Says Mr. Lightbulb Head over here.
Yeah, call me King Neptune, because I'm gonna shove a trident up your ass.
Can't be any worse than the Scooper. Survived worse than you.
Your arm looks like you got it on sale at Spirit Halloween.
Your teeth look like McDonald's tater tots.
You were an accident!
I will beat you over the head with my shoe, I swear to God.
Your clown shoes that you got at the clown store.
I'm not the one who made Balloon Boy.
Don't speak ill of him. He's like my real son.
Well, what do you even see in that thing?
He's like Bart Simpson.
Any follow-up on that?
Leave me alone, Michael!
To get to the best ending, we've got 3 important minigames to cover: Security Puppet, Fruity Maze, and Midnight Motorist. The Security Puppet minigame allows us to see the puppet preventing children with colored bracelets from exiting the premises to keep them safe. After doing this a few times, the box is blocked from the top, preventing it from getting outside to help a child, one with a green bracelet. The puppet does finally get outside, but by that time, the child is already dead, and we see tire tracks next to her corpse. The rain damages the puppet as it crawls over to the child and deactivates. This portrays the origins of how the puppet came to be possessed, and likely depicts the fate of the child left outside in the first FNAF 2 death minigame, meaning we know exactly now what happened to them. Fruity Maze puts us in control of a little blonde girl collecting fruits within a time limit. If we succeed in getting all of them, the game degrades the next time around, with the fruits becoming, oh god. More and more, we can see the reflection of a sad girl in the game's screen. The next time, the dogs look even worse, coffins and flowers littering the maze with its blood. Inevitably running out of time, you'll see William Afton behind the girl in his spring Bonnie suit, saying,
"He's not really dead. He's over here. Follow me."
This is one of William's original victims, who was lured backstage by the promise of seeing her deceased pet. And finally, we have Midnight Motorist. It's a simple game where you avoid other purple cars as a race car, but if you veer toward an open border at the bottom of the screen, you'll be given a winding path on a rainy night. Seem familiar? The project file for Pizzeria Sim, made with ClickTeam Fusion, literally labels this section Later That Night, implying it's a continuation of the Security Puppet minigame. In it, we control an Orange Man? Oh god, come on, make this easier for me, please. He goes to a place called Junior's. We don't really know anything about this place, but the guard at the door, a green man, tells us that we know we can't be here, and to leave without making this any more difficult than it needs to be. From here, we can go to visit a mound of dirt in the forest, or head home where someone is watching television. This person tells us to leave him alone tonight. He had a rough day. If we continue up to the next room, though, the orange man yells at the apparent child for closing their door, saying this is his house and he can't be ignored, demanding that the door be opened. Going around back to the window, we find it shattered, with small footprints and large footprints next to it. To which the orange man says, "Ran off to that place again. He'll be sorry when he gets back." Many people interpret the orange man as being William Afton, the person in the chair as Michael or some other relative, and the runaway child as being the crying child. Despite the fact that the car looks somewhat similar to William's and the Later That Night naming scheme, though, I don't think so. I'm willing to buy that this takes place on the same night as the puppet's haunting, but for reasons I'll explain later, I just don't think this being William makes a ton of sense. I do, however, think that it could perhaps be a parent of one of the missing kids, as the footsteps imply a child being lured away by someone in an animatronic suit. Though, hopefully it wasn't a Springlock suit in that rain, unless William really is favored by the devil. You'd have to have impossible amounts of luck not to get yourself skewered out there otherwise.
I just wore a poncho.
It fit over the suit.
Michael, I've made a lot of stupid shit over the years.
Now then, with all of our animatronics in a row and explanations slotted into place, let's see how this show comes together. If we go out of our way to not salvage any animatronics, we get something called the insanity ending. And we can hear the Cassette Man's motives, and they're pretty revealing. He describes William as a monster and says he unwillingly helped to create said monster by helping to make the animatronics themselves. Remember back in FNAF 2 when Phone Guy says they were trying to get in touch with the original owner of the diner? Well, Cassette Man is that guy, the co-founder of the chain along with William. For the sake of convenience, I'm just going to call him by his actual name from now on, which is Henry Emily. That name is never revealed in the games, but it was revealed in the novels. I'm still not factoring the novels into my story analysis here, but at some points the cross-media storytelling is actually the only way to learn anything about certain pieces of relevant information. All that to say, Henry is determined to lure all of the souls back to one place because he needs to do what he can to undo William's deeds and bring everything to an end. This leads us to the true ending of the game, where with all of the animatronics together, he can carry out his plan as outlined in Michael's contract. Baby is about to attack us, thinking that all of the souls have been gathered together for her father, who she says she will make proud, before she is cut off by Henry, who of course delivers one of the hardest monologues in all of gaming.
Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth, if you still even remember that name, but I'm afraid you've been misinformed. You are not here to receive a gift, nor have you been called here by the individual you assume, although you have indeed been called. You have all been called here, into a labyrinth of sounds and smells, misdirection and misfortune. A labyrinth with no exit, a maze with no prize. You don't even realize that you are trapped. Your lust for blood has driven you in endless circles, chasing the cries of children in some unseen chamber, always seeming so near, yet somehow out of reach. But you will never find them. None of you will. This is where your story ends. And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you. Although there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be. I am remaining as well. I am nearby. This place will not be remembered, and the memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away, as the agony of every tragedy should. And to you monsters trapped in the corridors, be still, and give up your spirits. They don't belong to you. For most of you, I believe there is peace, and perhaps more, waiting for you after the smoke clears. Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole, so don't keep the devil waiting, old friend. My daughter, if you can hear me, I knew you would return as well. It's in your nature to protect the innocent. I'm sorry that on that day, the day you were shut out and left to die, no one was there to lift you up into their arms, the way you lifted others into yours. And then, what became of you? I should have known you wouldn't be content to disappear. Not my daughter. I couldn't save you then, so let me save you now. It's time to rest, for you, and for those you have carried in your arms. This ends, for all of us, in communication.
And there it is. Let me give you the skinny if you're confused. So first of all, we've got a name for Afton's daughter who is possessing Baby, Elizabeth. She was under the mistaken impression that her father called everyone here, but of course, it was Henry. Henry also created Lefty, whose sole purpose was to capture the puppet, who possesses the spirit of Henry's daughter. We don't get a name for this child in the actual game, but for the sake of convenience, we'll go with her name from the books, which is Charlie. Charlie, once possessing the puppet, would go on to protect the murdered children taken by William by doing for them what happened to her, bonding them to the original animatronics, which would eventually lead to their cornering of William, which would get him killed and turned into Springtrap. This unfortunately didn't seem to be the end for them though, as they're still here, and now they, the original victims, along with Charlie, Henry, who feels partially responsible for all of this, William, and his two remaining children, will all be burned to the ground. For those whose innocence remains, Henry believes they have solace in what lies ahead, but William, the monster who started all of this, will be paying for his crimes forever. Though an escape was prepared for Michael, he intends to go down with the ship, content to have helped Henry put an end to his family's twisted legacy and finally atoning for the mistakes he made as a boy. In the end, the corporate voice that welcomed us here tells us that Fazbear Entertainment values atoning for past mistakes and tying up loose ends, and that the corporation is officially being dissolved for good, an end to an era. you know, until it became even more profitable. To top it all off, you can even get an extra image at the end for getting all of the lore-related content. A picture of gravestones, 2 obscured and 4 clear, listing the names Gabriel, Fritz, Susie, and Jeremy. Presumably the missing children. 2 of those are pretty weirdly familiar, huh? Now, all of this is pretty darn satisfying, but I'm sure you're wondering, wait a minute, weren't the souls of the missing kids released at the end of FNAF 3? Like, why are they still here? And how? Where? Like the Candy Cadet told us, it's heavily implied they're in Molten Freddy, but Molten Freddy, as you may remember, is composed of the Fun Times, sans the newly evicted baby. So how does that work? In the Insanity endings, there are a load of schematics for us to root through, and we find that the Scooper from Sister Location has a mechanism for injecting something called Remnant.
She did it again, everybody! The secret word! Woo!
Not this time.
Now, while you can't find this in-game, in the files you can also find blueprints for Molten Freddy himself, saying that he contains, quote, the most amount of Remnant collectively in its structure. Let's use this moment for a brief recess from Pizzeria Sim to talk about something that's bugged me for the past 2 entries, but I haven't had a reason to bring up properly just yet. Here's why Remnant is stupid.
I think you're nuts.
Now, what the hell is Remnant? Well, first and foremost, it makes my current method of analysis hit a brick wall. Because in the games, this is never directly explained until FNAF AR, the mobile game.
What? What's shadowy remnant? What are you talking about?
It is mentioned in the books, but not anywhere here beyond these missable blueprints. You could certainly speculate why all of this is happening, but when looking for definite answers, Remnant is your one-stop shop for plot resolutions in the later games. In most cases, I don't think this affects too much, but in a few particular cases, it's the only solution you can point to. You see, Remnant is this supernatural substance that William experimented with, which he wound up discovering by chance while working with the haunted animatronics. It's composed of, oh boy, here we go, mercury-like goop which physically represents memories and emotions, the most potent of which being rage. This gunk can then be injected into machines, turning them into sentient objects.
I don't believe that.
This is Scott's sci-fi explanation of how the hauntings work, basically, and I, have some opinions about that, but while in the best cases it's just unnecessary padding, like, man, just say they're haunted. You don't need science goop for that. The instances in which it actually is very important lie within these last couple of games, namely to explain how Molten Freddy contains the missing children and how Michael still gets up after being scooped. Both of these beats can only logically be answered by Remnant. The Fun Times all seem to have been injected with the Remnant that William took from the original animatronics when he broke them down to experiment on them in FNAF 3, and the Scooper injecting Remnant is what's keeping Michael on his feet even when he's a corpse. Without this, there's really no good reason why Molten Freddy should house these souls, or why Michael should be up and about. This entire concept feels like it only comes about due to Scott writing himself into a corner. I'm sure he likes Remnant and doesn't think it's kind of stupid like I do, but because the kids were released in FNAF 3 and the series carried on anyway, in order to make it narratively satisfying, those missing kids still needed to be around somehow in order to play a part in this big finale. Michael also needed to be here to avenge the sins of his father, or whatever, so there needed to be a way to ensure his survival even though his scooping was necessary to get entered here, which is literally all of the missing kids and Elizabeth. There's plenty to harp on about, but I just wanted to shake the subject off while it's relevant, because most of the time you really don't have to think about it. The moments that make Remnant suck the most only wind up affecting the story if you go through all the effort of applying it retroactively, which for our purposes isn't needed, but it definitely affects how the story wants you to read it. Going down this route, Remnant constantly snowballs itself into being more and more bizarre the longer you try to stuff it in. William goes back to the original pizzeria to try to cover his tracks. No, he was just coming back for the goop.
So now you're here for the goop.
FNAF 2 animatronics on the fritz, Willy gooped him up. For all the answers Remnant creates, it does a lot more to ruin the mystery and fear of the story, solving questions that nobody needed answers for except YouTubers and wiki editors. This wraps us back around to my thoughts on Pizzeria Simulator as a whole. If you squint, I still think this is a pretty satisfying ending. It just kind of falls apart under scrutiny, given the framework we're working with. The particulars aside, I still really love the concept. Bringing the puppet back around to give Henry more of a personal motive, specifying his relationship to William, and letting him put it all to rest himself with Michael's help, that rocks. It gives me more to chew on with regards to William himself, because now I can finally explain what I think his motives were. The killing started after the death of the crying child, meaning William must have discovered the first hauntings around that time. I will put you back together implies he meant to use these methods to figure something out, whether to either bring his son back or make him immortal as a machine. To this end, he continued killing kids to examine this phenomenon, and in the process ended up killing Charlie, the daughter of his business partner. Maybe he did it for revenge, because Henry was partially responsible for designing the robots that killed his kid too. Who knows? This eventually went way out of control, and even William's own daughter was accidentally killed, sending him further spiraling down the hole, to the point where all of this seemingly just became an excuse for him to act on his wicked impulses. Now, after such a long time, Michael, his only living child, who severely regrets what he did to his younger brother and inadvertently kicked all of this off, has teamed up with Henry to put a stop to his father's deeds once and for all, to bury the trauma and scarring legacy of Fazbear Entertainment and shut the whole thing down for good. This is also why I don't really think the orange guy from Midnight Motorist is William. If the child who ran away was the crying child, William's treating him pretty horribly for a guy who was seemingly so devastated by his death that he would then go around killing other kids in an attempt to understand how to bring him back or immortalize him somehow. Maybe I'm off there though, it can be interpreted many different ways. That's just my 2 cents. Oh, yeah, they also retconned the box too, by the way. Remember the box from FNAF 4? Well, regardless of my thoughts, we end up seeing it's the shape of this franchise location's map during the fire scene, which is cool and all, but it holds a lot less weight when you find out Scott admitted in an interview with Daco that the contents of the box changed several times over the years due to rampant fan theorizing, and you can clearly tell. And therein lies the core problem with Pizzeria Sim as a conclusion. It has a lot of strong ideas, but the establishing details are so interpretive and heavily dependent on external media that trying to examine it from the POV of someone who only wants to play the games isn't really going to get you much of anywhere. No matter what, there will always be gaps in your understanding, which is fine in some instances, but here it quickly outweighs its welcome. I'm clearly not a Remnant fan, but for the type of person who can at least stomach its presence in the story and is familiar with the extended media, Pizzeria Sim makes about the most perfect conclusion you could ask for if the story needed to be dragged on for this much longer. For the purposes of narrative analysis, though, you might as well have stuck to the ending of FNAF 3 in my opinion. It winds up just making a lot more sense with a lot less hoops to jump through. This game has a fantastically creative gameplay loop, really cool execution, incredible voice work, and a damn satisfying conclusion, but only in concept. In practice, it's too convoluted for its own good, suffers from having unfun sections, has some subpar character design, and stumbles through its strongest beats because you need to be a lore expert to get the most out of it. At least it's free, right?
Hey, speaking of free.
Every good story, subjectively, needs an epilogue, right? Well, actually no, but a lot of them do anyway, don't they? That was the idea behind Ultimate Custom Night, a game capping off the original run of the Click Team era. It was released in late June of 2018, not quite another year later, but still a pretty decent amount of time afterward. The game doesn't really have much story to speak of, it's just a big challenge round created by Scott as a thank you to the fans. It includes nearly every animatronic from across the whole series, as well as several bonus characters, all with their own custom mechanics and adjustable difficulty levels. 59 animatronics total, with 50 selectable and others resulting from in-game events, meaning the coveted challenge of FNAF tubers the world round would now be fighting uphill against 50 pissed-off animatronics set to the hardest difficulty all at once. God bless their souls. There's a few Easter eggs of note which help round out the narrative, Yandere Chica and Anime Foxy notwithstanding. No, actually, the Yandere Chica stuff may be a thinly veiled way to communicate how William lured his victims. I'm not choosing to put those pieces together. All of the animatronics have unique lines for when they kill you, and while most of them are humorous zingers or one-liners, some of them are actually very revealing to the nature of what Ultimate Custom Night actually is.
I will never let you leave. I will never let you rest.
The fire within me burns eternal, and now you shall as well. He's here and always watching, the one you shouldn't have killed.
This is how it feels, and you get to experience it over and over and over again, forever. I will never let you leave.
He tried to release you. He tried to release us. But I'm not gonna let that happen. I will hold you here. I will keep you here, no matter how many times they burn us.
I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore.
We know who our friends are, and you are not one of them.
One of the children is determined to keep William Afton in a living hell of his own creation for all eternity, trapping him in this posthumous illusionary cage where all of his misdeeds literally come back to haunt him, tormenting him with death after death with no clear end in sight. This is accredited to a mysterious child known only as the one you should not have killed, which is mentioned by multiple animatronics in their jump scares. This child is heavily speculated to be the one who possessed Golden Freddy, as after you attain a certain score, you can watch the final cutscene of Golden Freddy twitching on a black background, reminiscent of William's twitching after being spring-locked. Along with Golden Freddy's constantly limp appearance, whichever child William stuffed into Golden Freddy must have died a particularly painful death because of those spring locks, and is far more hellbent on vengeance than the rest of the spirits as a result. To further support this, we also have a minigame with Old Man Consequences, a hidden character you could find in FNAF World. Here he tells us to rest and to, quote, leave the demon to his demons, further implying that this is a punishment specifically for William. The droning audio in this section can be sped up to sound a lot like someone screaming, further supporting this idea. There's not much else to this hellish horror show from here, aside from little tidbits you get from some of the animatronics' jumpscare lines. The Fredbear death screen, for example, talks about fantasy and fun from the restaurant's tagline, and finding a suit that's right for you. Assuming this thing is possessed by the original child who started it all, William's youngest son, that'd be quite the twist of fate, wouldn't it? Withered Chica says she was the first, and many believe this to be Susie, the girl from the Fruity Maze minigame. Mr. Hippo delivers humorously overblown monologues which go on for minutes at a time, which may even be humorous comments on how the FNAF fanbase tended to dissect every little thing. Sometimes a story is just a story. Yeah, if only. As an epilogue, this is pretty satisfying, discounting all of the stuff about the dreaded R-word and all the other confusing lore notes that harshed our vibe back in Pizzeria Sim. There's nothing wrong with leaving things on this note. A bit Old Testament, sure, but what more did you expect from the guy who built himself up on Bible study adventure games? Plus, I doubt anyone was really hankering for a William Afton redemption arc. Him being tormented by the manifestations of what he did to these kids until the end of time seems to be a fair trade for the amount of terror, misfortune, and suffering he's left in his wake, whether it be directly or indirectly. He's ruined plenty of people's lives. It's the least he deserves, frankly. You might have noticed I haven't said much of anything regarding how you actually play through FNAF Expert Mode, and that's because I don't find Ultimate Custom Night to be that fun. But it's just meant to be streamer fodder. Aside from its loose narrative value as an epilogue, there isn't a frequent reason to come back to this one. Can't complain, free's free. I just wish half the jump scares weren't flashing PNGs, though. And that's the original story of FNAF.
You solved Five Nights at Freddy's.
Plenty of strange decisions would follow in the Steelwool sequels to come, and I don't plan to get into them. Calling the veracity of the canon entirely into question, new characters, a virtual brainwashing program, Afton coming back again because screw Henry and all of his and Michael's efforts in FNAF 6? Yeah, I've officially clocked out. I'm content to let it go here for several reasons. For now, it's time we retrospect on everything we've seen so far and come to a conclusion about how it all stacks up. Let's talk about one of the most important aspects of a story, its characters. What do we really know about these guys? Who are the star players? Who's got the most information about them on display in the narrative we've managed to assemble? We're going to take it from the top with the ones we know the most about, starting with...
William Afton!
He's essentially the main character of the saga in many ways. He's a serial killer, but he's also a British dad, which is in some ways arguably more evil. I'm of two minds when it comes to William as an antagonist. He's very charismatic, and he's got a scary-ass design of Springtrap, and a lot of the mystery that's built up around him was formative in what made this franchise so interesting. He's also got a decently compelling background, if you believe the whole thing about the crying child being the original victim. It injects him with just enough pathos to make him someone you can comprehend the motives of, even if his actions are so horrible that you could never excuse them. Back in the FNAF 1 section, I mentioned Autobiography of a Yogi. Here's where I think this takes on some surprising relevance. The quote from it that FNAF used audio of was about how a scientist has to be satisfied with the mere act of helping and hoping that his work will become relevant in the future, because many of their advancements won't be recognized or put to good use during their lifetime. This is pretty ironic when you consider William's character. He tried and tried to make a breakthrough, thinking he could reap the rewards of his research while he was alive, but in the end, his own creations led to his demise. His hubris trapped him in a cage of his own making, and posthumously, his creations did lead to something, but that something was nothing but a joke. That joke had no punchline until he came along, sentencing him to a grave of irrelevance where his desires were twisted in on themselves, crowning him the subject of their agony for all time. Pretty metal, no pun intended. But as the series went along, William became a byproduct of Scott's fixation on sci-fi in a way that I feel kind of stunted what his character still had to offer. He's kind of stupid when it comes to covering his tracks, yet he still gets away with almost everything because apparently the police are so incompetent that finding corpses inside of machines that are frequently complained about for their smell is just too difficult. He creates restaurants with the world's shittiest wiring and facilities, but he can afford to build futuristic robotic bunkers where he creates state-of-the-art machines with futuristic eyeball security scanners and can discover a primordial ooze that brings them to life Pinocchio style. Also, again, he's British for some reason. Jokes aside, these games mostly seem to take place in America. That's where the whole Chuck E. Cheese brand comes from, after all. And he's just kind of the only guy around like this? Did he immigrate to America just to build these restaurants? Part of me wants to say this is so it's easier to identify him and his relatives, since they all have the same distinct accent, but also I think he operates on a child's logic of what a scary guy would be like. Oh yeah, let's just give him a cartoonishly evil British accent because he's evil. It's fun, sure, but it does take me out of the scene a bit. He's kind of a microcosm of FNAF as a whole in many ways. When he's interesting, he's really damn interesting, and constructed with enough solid ideas to make him worth exploring and being as investing as a character can be. It's just that the more he has to adapt to the expanding story, the more he starts to be stretched too thin. And nothing can last forever, even if it does always try to come back.
What? I already said it once. Don't expect more fanfare.
Elizabeth Afton!
Do I look? Elizabeth, on the other hand, is probably my favorite character, or at least she is in Sister Location. I already said my piece back in that section about why I think she's really well executed, and I don't really have any other complaints to toss in. She and Ennard by extension are interesting concepts, and the only thing I truly dislike about Baby is how she devolves in Pizzeria Sim. It's lame seeing her go from this calculating, manipulative, deeply tragic character into being William's lackey who talks about how much she wants to please Daddy. I suppose there is a level of tragedy inherent to this too, believing that she can find fulfillment by following the orders of a father who, in all likelihood, stopped caring about her a long time ago, but this trait of hers only seems to have been amped up so she could be dunked on by Henry. And hey, speaking of Henry...
Henry Emily!
All he could do was watch the trains rushing through the other tunnel.
Henry is something of a strange case. We know almost nothing about him from the majority of the series, and even when he's finally introduced, we have to make serious leaps to suss out his identity without the books to guide us. In that vein, us game-onlys wouldn't even know his name. Even so, he is pretty fascinating. Aside from having one of the hardest monologues in video game history, he actually has a super compelling placement in this story, as the business partner of a monster wronged by the person who he thought was close to him and kept awake at night ever since. He talks at length in the Insanity ending of Pizzeria Sim about how he ponders the sentience of the animatronics and is haunted by whether the children are aware or not. He even talks about going to sleep forever, but says he can't do that until he's righted the wrongs he's partially responsible for. Henry is arguably enduring the most pain in this series, and by that same logic is one of its most human. Also, Dave Steele does a fantastic job with his voice. Seriously, the second best performance in this series next to Baby's in my opinion. Iconic stuff. Henry is one of the few in this series who talks a lot, and thus gives us a lot to chew on, but you don't always need to be chatty to be memorable. Silent storytelling has always been FNAF's strength in my opinion, so let's mull on a guy we get seldom few words from, but is still very compelling nevertheless.
Michael Afton!
Michael, it's your birthday today. Taking ice cream is on its way.
Michael is the guy of all time. We get little in the way of actual direct characterization from him, but his actions speak louder than words often can. He's been through so much, and it inarguably comes from a place of immense guilt, trying to fix what he feels he inadvertently wrought and close a painful chapter of so many other people's lives, not just his own, in the process. Initially aimless, easily manipulated, and bent on earning his father's renewed affection, he eventually makes a bold decision to abandon all pretenses of satisfying someone so evil, and instead does what he thinks he can to seal all of that pain in the past, for the children, for his sister, and for himself. All of this comes at the expense of his time, his energy, his insides, and then eventually his own damn life. While there's no proof for the prevalent fan theory that Michael is actually the protagonist of previous games in the series using an alias, in fact there's more than enough to suggest this isn't the case, I can see why that theory is almost ubiquitously accepted. It only adds to the tapestry of just how damn much the guy goes through, and that resonates with people for a reason. It's immensely compelling to imagine someone with flaws, regrets, and his fair share of abuse powering through it all and coming out the other end a hero for the people who need it. With only a few lines of dialogue, one of the goofiest cutscenes in the series, and otherwise vignettes to portray all of this, Michael Afton comes out of this whole sordid affair as one of the most genuinely likable characters in the franchise. That's pretty damn impressive. My only complaint is that I wish there were more of him. Oh, and that he didn't make Remnant necessary to understand. But don't sweat it, we all make mistakes, Michael. Speaking of mistakes,
The Possessed Animatronics.
These guys vary wildly in terms of their individual relevance and characterization. All of them get voice lines in Ultimate Custom Night for what it's worth, but for the most part they're entirely silent. Thus, there's little to go on besides their behaviors, like Foxy's tendency to run down hallways or Chica's insistence on banging around in the kitchen at 4 in the morning.
Me too, girl.
The ones you'll get the most direct characterization from are the talking ones, and ironically, I think this makes them a bit worse off than the ones who are mute. Functionally, the most important aspect of the animatronics is to scare the player, and the cartoon dialogue is not often terrifying. The slow-building dread I get when faced with these hulking creatures who wordlessly stare into the abyss, though, yeah, that's the reason why I'll never finish FNAF VR. They don't really need that direct characterization to be compelling because the raw fear they invoke is more than enough, and perfect for what they're meant to do. That isn't to say that the implication of the missing children isn't equally tragic. It definitely adds an emotional texture to what would otherwise be jump scare fodder, which makes them more initially interesting than you would assume. Behind those glowing, hollow eyes, you have to imagine the suffering specter of some poor, unsuspecting soul listlessly stomping degrading halls for decades, trying to satiate some burning hatred that it can neither extinguish or understand. As much as they're here to make you suffer, they're suffering just as much, if not more, and I can't really ask for more out of antagonists in a game like this. I wish that hands-off approach had been maintained in the future, as the more over-the-top malicious characterization of future animatronics made the waters much less murky and made them more like cookie-cutter black and white antagonists, shaving away at their nuance in a way that I think makes them far less interesting to interpret. I'm not even touching on Security Breach here, but that's my problem with those animatronics too. They function better as individual characters in my mind than, say, the Fun Times did, but they lost the spark of what made them horror characters. Now they're just actual cartoons, complete with larger-than-life personalities, backstories, and so on. With all of their gaps filled in so thoroughly, it's difficult to be afraid of them rather than sympathize with them. That just means all you get to suggest their ferocity is a jump scare, which is as brief and meaningless as having someone jump in front of you and yell boo. Sometimes less is more.
Phone guy.
Ring ring. Hello.
William,
We are banned from using the phone? Okay.
Phone Guy is another pretty simple character to examine. He's another one of the scant few with dialogue in the series, but what's funny is that much like Henry, we know even less about him. He's a corporate mouthpiece who gives you info dumps and sometimes off-color jokes about how you're probably going to become another casualty of the company. You know, definitely what you want in a trainer. Other than that, he, really likes Foxy. Understandable, I guess. Foxy's pretty base. Oh, and he also gets murdered in the back room by animatronics, probably the most iconic thing he's ever done other than say hello, hello. To this day, I still kind of picture him as having a telephone for a head. I remember when MatPat thought he was the killer, and he definitely isn't, but it says something that he's so awkward that for a while we all assumed he could be. In reality, this is the kind of guy I imagine went home and posted about Transformers on ToonZone. God rest his soul, he is never getting that promotion, and we love his silly catchphrases.
The other protagonists.
Do you smell it? That smell. The kind of smelly smell. The smelly smell that smells smelly.
These nobodies are in a similar ballpark. Mike Schmidt is almost certainly not Michael Afton, and he really feels like it. Who even knows anything about this guy, other than that he's a glutton for punishment and presumably smells bad? That's a trait he shares with Jeremy Fitzgerald, too, which means the only presumed difference between the two of these entire guys is that Jeremy might have been given a forcible lobotomy on the job, which is not something a lot of people can say. Well, actually, presuming the lobotomy itself, I'm not sure they could say it anyway. The strongest bit of characterization any of the FNAF protagonists aside from Michael have is that I have to believe they're so unbelievably broke that the only reason they would feasibly keep returning to work after what happens to them is that they're eating gruel and drinking tap water. Unless you're fishing leftover tortellini out of someone's sink pipes, I am not working for $6 an hour to have Fur Affinity's The Terminator attempt to shove my head through a fruit juicer. These guys need benefits. Is there a Fazbear Employees Union? Somebody get on that. Maybe remind them that OSHA exists while you're at it.
Balloon Boy.
I don't want to alarm you.
Balloon Boy is the most important character in Five Nights at Freddy's. Why? Because he's funny.
Golden Freddy.
You look like Freddy Fazbear. What are you gonna say now?
And last but not least, we have Golden Freddy, or as I like to call them, the most pissed off 11-year-old in history. Many people like to refer to this child as Cassidy, but as far as I can tell, it's more of a suspicion that comes from logbook stuff than concrete fact. Though I'm sure, like many things, this will be vehemently corrected for me by the lore warriors, or loriers. Either way, the one you should not have killed, as I will call them, is another character we don't know too terribly much about. Other than that they want to drag William into an eternal torturous hell, which I support. Considering the whole idea of this kid being the only one who is spring-locked and knowing what a slow, painful process that is to die from, it's no wonder that while the other animatronics may have gotten their kicks already, that doesn't mean everyone will be satisfied. I have to wonder if the narrative decision to bring William back after this point, a decision I definitely dislike but understand as a financial choice, could be tied to this. There is some rich irony which comes from the idea of a monster finally getting his punishment, only to narrowly escape because his victim couldn't accept the rest they've been given. Just think about everything this guy has done and tell me you wouldn't feel at least an inkling of the same anger in that position. It makes for some compelling dramatic irony, at least in theory. That's all there really is to say about them, though. It's mostly theory, which can be interesting for storytelling, as FNAF has proven time and again, but as it has also proven, that's not always enough to build a foundation. Sometimes, to reach your audience, you need something a little more solid. And what could be more solid than a Hollywood film adaptation? Yeah, I know, I said no supplemental material or alternate timelines, but just for the very end of this video, I'm going to break my own rule one last time. Specifically to talk briefly about the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. Why? Because Scott Cawthon had his mitts all over this thing and refused to put it to print unless he felt it got his vision right. So why don't we put his feet to the fire and all that money where his mouth is? What better medium is there to act as a proving ground for whether this storyline held any merit in the first place than a movie? It takes multiple creative liberties, and it has to because of what it's going for, but the fact remains that it is attempting to translate the appeal of the original material into a medium which, at least more often, is treated very differently. While films can be just as esoteric and interpretive as any other medium, mainstream Hollywood flicks most often aren't going to be like that, and therefore with them comes an expectation that your story will be straightforward and easy to understand. FNAF's entire wheelhouse has been vague and interpretive, though, so surely seeing it spelled out in a clearer way will give us an idea of whether the core appeal holds up, right? The film follows Mike Schmidt, aka not Michael Afton, as he attempts to lucid dream his way into the past while working at Freddy's to save his kidnapped brother Garrett, a Baptist name if I've ever heard one, from the mysterious child killer he doesn't remember from his past. That guy also happens to be William Afton, whose name you find out about 3/4 of the way through the movie, who is also responsible for getting the animatronics at the place haunted. Mike is accompanied by his sister Abby, who communes with the ghosts for unknown reasons, and who is naive to their intent to make her a ghost too because they're lonely. There's also police officer Vanessa, who is transplanted out of security breach and into this narrative to instead be William Afton's traumatized child because he doesn't have enough of those yet. William Afton himself is portrayed quite brilliantly in the 2 whole scenes he has by the aforementioned Matthew Lillard, who does the scream knife thing, but will most likely be remembered more by the film's target audience as Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. The FNAF movie is your typical Blumhouse budget buster, though because of its PG-13 rating, I'd liken it more to an occasionally humorous thriller than a horror movie. Though it does have at least one decently gruesome, if unseen and undeserved kill. The translation of the storyline to the big screen feels a little too padded by my standards. It's almost 2 hours long, and it feels like it. There is a major dip in the second act that I'd argue the film just barely recovers from via fanservice. As for whether it captures the core appeal though, I'd say it does a halfway decent job. One of the primary conceits of the early FNAF story was the mystery that everyone was interested in, and while most people are going to go into this knowing what will happen, it makes an okay attempt at seeding bits and pieces along before eventually building up to a reveal. For reference, I knew for a fact seeing this film that I wouldn't be able to make an objective observation of how this worked for newcomers, because I've been acquainted with the franchise for close to 10 years now.
Oh god, has it really been 10 years? I feel so old.
So to get that fresh perspective, I actually decided to do a little something. I recently visited my folks back home while going to the Sonic Symphony concert. Amazing concert, by the way. And while I was there, I decided to watch the movie with my mom and dad to get their takes as people who had never been exposed to the franchise outside of osmosis from me and their grandkids. To my surprise, they both liked it quite a lot, thoroughly engaged and attentive throughout. My dad struggles to stay awake during a lot of films, but he was up and at it the whole time. Some of my bigger complaints as a fan washed over them as newcomers, and even William's motives not being explored didn't register as negatives to them because the story functioned well enough on its own with making it clear that He's just kind of a weirdo. Even with that past litmus test, I by no means believe the film is flawless or even really good, but that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it or see the merit in how it presented FNAF's narrative. It trims down a lot of the fat, excises the sci-fi stuff, and hones in on the human connections of the characters and the mystery at play. And in the process, it actually does very well for itself with those guidelines in place. Though you can really feel those sometimes tonally clashing Christian roots wriggling in from Scott's heavy hand.
And we hold hands and say grace.
Unlike the games, it didn't overcomplicate itself, and I can only hope it stays on a similar track for its inevitable sequels. As a movie, I can take it or leave it, but as an adaptation, it makes some smart improvements, even if not in all areas. It's much different than I thought it would be, but maybe that shows the inherent paradoxical strength of FNAF's winding narrative. Everybody is going to get something different out of it. Some of the most popular interpretations of the material aren't even canon, or are outright budging up against established canon in obvious ways, but those theories' prominence speaks to something that you don't often get in other stories. FNAF has uniquely captured engagement precisely because of its unconventional style of storytelling. For as much frustration as I can convey about the way it goes about telling its story, I can't deny the fact that its tendency to leave gaps unfilled has galvanized an entire legion of dedicated fans who are hooked by its simple premise. More than happy to fill those blanks with whatever appeals to them the most. Truly, every copy of Five Nights at Freddy's is personalized, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have unique interpretations of the material myself, that I know are probably leagues away from what its creator intended. That is, in many ways, the fun of it.
Scholars will say that my theories are all made up, but so is the source material.
As for what actually remains when you scoop out the guts of fandom osmosis, the endoskeleton of a story that is the factual information we have from the games and the games only, it's a fascinating little outline. It doesn't always work and often gets ahead of itself, but it has a lot of strong beats which make it convincingly interesting, enough so that its continued success doesn't surprise me. Art needn't be perfect to be popular, it just needs to be resonant. Sometimes a story is just a story. A story about cyclical trauma, cynical neglect, and the feeling of being haunted, both literally and figuratively. But also a story of overcoming personal grief, reconciling past guilt, and building a better future for the kids of tomorrow, who hopefully will be able to avoid the tragedies of yesterday, no matter how many times they keep trying to crawl back from underneath the surface. It's a story about families that fall apart, the almost inevitable hurt and pain we cause each other, and the ways, imperfect or otherwise, we try to heal from those things, despite it all. Whether through the recognition of others, the release of our long-held grips, or the cleansing fire of a long undelivered finale. It can be terrifying to be acknowledged, but when your pain has been shoved under the rug for God knows how long, the best feeling in the world is being seen by someone and to unwaveringly speak up and say, "It's me." To hear the words "you can't" and decide to go for it anyway. Because the only thing stopping us from saving people is our own inaction. If we really want to do it, all we have to do is try again and again and again until this ends. For all of us. And that's why I don't really think it's such a bad thing to say that I'm just not personally interested in the future of this franchise. The new stuff just doesn't gel with me the same way, and that's fine. Not everything is going to continue to appeal to you the way it once did. That doesn't necessarily mean the new stuff is bad, it just isn't going in a direction I personally find interesting. Instead of staying on the boat only to complain, I've decided to swim elsewhere. And there's a lot of people who could stand to do so with properties they've since soured on. But I'd be lying if I said my disinterest in this new strain of kid-friendly FNAF is the only thing that's put me off of it. Yeah, it's about time I brought up the Orville elephant in the room. Sorry, guys. A few years back, there was some mild controversy with the series creator, Scott Cawthon. Scott made some pretty sizable donations to specific right-wing politicians, and while many would argue politics shouldn't be relevant to your enjoyment of a franchise, for marginalized groups that can sometimes be a bit of a tough ask. Especially if the guy's money is going to people who actively advocate for those groups having their human rights stripped away from them. For what it's worth, Scott doesn't seem like a bad guy in a demonstrably evil sense to me. In fact, he's often pretty funny, communicative, and charming, and he doesn't deserve to be harassed or doxxed or what have you. But I also don't know the guy. What I do know are the causes I care about as a trans woman who has seen vitriol merely for existing, over and over again. I don't feel comfortable tossing the guy my money anymore, specifically because I can't judge where it's going and what exact purposes they serve to him, especially if it gets funneled towards any cause that can hurt me and my loved ones. If people can ask for Scott's privacy and autonomy to be respected for his decisions, it shouldn't be a huge ask to respect the same from his fans, who may feel betrayed enough not to want to continue buying stuff from him, right? This is the first time I'm talking about FNAF on my channel, but since I've covered basically everything I had any active interest in before I dropped off the franchise, it'll also probably be the last. I came back to it to answer a simple question. Did Five Nights at Freddy's ever have a good story? It's a cop-out answer, but it's also the only answer. It depends on who you ask. Your mileage may vary, but for what I put into it, I think I was able to get a lot out of it. And that personal enjoyment can be enough. It's fine to cash out when you aren't getting returns on your investment anymore, rather than letting your payout dwindle with each successive disappointment. Back in my Danganronpa retrospective, I said these videos are like autopsies for me. I want to go back to things I cared about and figure out why, and then, when I'm done, I can finally say goodbye on whatever terms feel appropriate. For 10 years now, FNAF has been a part of my life. It got me through some of the most difficult times I ever had in high school, and every couple of years, whenever I'm having a spiral, it's a big comfort to return to a lot of those old Markiplier playlists, just to keep my mind on something else for a while. Freddy's future isn't mine. I've got better places to be. I just thought maybe we could sit down and share a pizza one last time before I got going. Our paths may converge again, though they probably won't, but I wanted to thank this series for putting me back together. I'll find other things I'm just as passionate about, if not more, and from creators I can personally connect with a bit more. That's all we can really ever ask of ourselves. When it comes to those of us who enjoy stories and what they can offer to our lives, no matter how young or how old you are, more fantasy and fun is always around the corner.
Anyway, Garden of Ban sweep.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching my first video of 2024. Happy belated New Year. I know this was a tiny bit different than my usual. I do have a lot of retrospective type videos on the docket for this year, and many more I want to get around to in the future, but it's not a format I want to always do non-stop. There are other thought experiments, thematic explorations, and loosely connected essay topics about media I'd love to tackle in the future, so this was my attempt at dipping my toes back into something different before I got busy again. Hopefully you liked it, and if you did, it'd be a huge help to represent that like with an actual like on the video. That, comments, and shares are seriously a huge help to me. What's also a huge help is obviously subscribing if you haven't already, and ringing the bell so you don't miss any notifications. I've been told recently that YouTube has apparently been a bit of a slacker when it comes to informing my subscribers about new content, so let's combat that together, shall we? You can also support me by joining my Patreon, sending one-time donations over Ko-fi, both linked in the description, or becoming a channel member. Any financial help is greatly appreciated. Money is always tight after the holidays, and paying rent is my #1 priority. I'd also like to be able to take my cat to the vet, please, and thanks. It was in no small part made even worse by the fact that I got incredibly sick while working on this video, so that's delayed things even more, and oh boy, I'm really stressed out. Before I go, I should also thank some of my lovely patrons, such as Serena Midori, Shogun DX, Friend of Dracula, Ali Oliver, Claire Mewboon, Noelle Hadley, Evanisha, Joseph Adams, Weecon, MJL, Lord Omega 12, KDAC1, Voidlich, White Toast, Layfam, Gabriel, T, Saxon, 16 Crows in a Trenchcoat, Cassie Reed, Daniel the Spaniel, Horsefry, CJ the Magic Man, JunePop45, Nisha O'Neill, and JS. As for what's coming up next, as promised, Ace Attorney will finally be returning. The Apollo Justice Trilogy collection is dropping from Capcom, which means I can finally talk about those games, starting with the entry the collection is named after, so stay tuned for more lawyer goodness. Until then, have a great one everybody, see you in the next video, peace.